mean, after the phone calls and anything else that's.
Yeah, I mean, when I had a tech company, I mean, we'd be there 9, 10 o'clock at night, easy. So.
Well, we run 2 10-hour shifts, so we start at 5 in the morning and go to 1 in the morning.
Are you on a 4-day?
Yep, 4-day
pattern?
work week. Yep.
Yeah.
It's great.
Of course, we're working overtime, which means everyone has the option of working Friday if they want to. So.
Yeah.
And so do you run just a 1 10-hour shift on Friday?
No, we run 2, but it's all voluntary. So no one has to work on Friday, but we open it up, and generally about 2/3 of the people come, and it works well. And then sometimes we just don't get enough for a shift and we don't have a shift. So it's the way it goes. There's a big psychological difference between asking people to volunteer to work overtime and telling them they have to work overtime. The same person who would refuse, a mandatory overtime gladly volunteers to work. It's just a psychological thing.
Yeah.
Respect for the individual.
Yeah. Choice.
That's right.
So speaking of choice, do they mask up?
We don't mask. It's pretty hot, and the guys need their glasses clear to look at their machines operating, whatever. And there's always the issue of glass fogging. But our machines are all situated where the guys are about 10 feet apart, and we have numerous fans running. So there's a tremendous turnover of the air within the plant. So we're sort of following the CDC guidelines. Lots of outside air and maintaining 6 feet, and that seems to be comfortable for people. I mean, it's in the foundry, it's 110 degrees today. There's no way you're going to work in 110 degree weather with a mask on.
So let's see who we. I didn't get any reports of anybody not being able to make it at 1. Did you get anything, Bruce?
Yeah, you and I. Yeah, John Beardmore sent us a note earlier.
Oh, John did. Okay.
Yes. Yep. He's got a work conflict, schedule conflict.
Okay. And let's see. I see John Morgan on. Bill's on. Let's see. Who are we missing? Dave Ryan on?
No, not yet.
Okay.
And let me just look. I don't think I got a note from him.
Barbara's on.
Picking up a sandwich to try and prepare for this unbelievable meeting.
It's like going to Hopkinton Town Meeting, Bill.
We should check in everybody's favorite snack.
All right, so I think we're just missing
Licorice.
David and John. So we good with that?
Yeah, John said he wouldn't make it. I don't see a note from David, so.
Okay. Well, we'll get. Let's get things rolling, and I know we got a long afternoon ahead. So yeah, get things started up. Terrific. Welcome, everybody. I will call to order the Commission to Study School Funding. Today is July 27th, 2020 at just after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and getting a little bit of a early start today, and we're going to be going a little longer than usual because we got a busy deliberation agenda, and as the Commission really sort of pivots from its learn and figure out the problem to really the next steps ahead. So let's see. Before we get things started, I'll call the roll of members consistent with the governor's emergency order, and I'll just start. Dave Luno reporting from Hopkinton with Ozzie the long-haired dachshund. Mel Myler?
Mel Myler from Port Clyde, Maine, and I'm by myself.
Great, thanks. And Dick? Dick Ames?
You're muted.
Say
Try it again.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah. So I'm here in Jaffrey. I'm here, and I'm here alone.
Great. Thanks, Dick. And Rick Ladd?
Hello, I'm present in Haverhill, New Hampshire, and alone.
Okay. And Jay?
In Stoddard and in a room by myself.
All right. Thanks. And John Morgan?
Here in Brentwood in a room by myself.
Okay. Bill Ardinger?
Everybody in my law office in Concord, New Hampshire by myself.
Okay. And Jane Bergeron?
Hi, everybody. Jane Bergeron here in Litchfield, at home alone with my black Lotus.
All right. Thanks, Jane. And Corinne Cascadden?
Corinne Cascadden, alone in Berlin, New Hampshire.
Okay. And I don't see Dave Ryan on. And John is not going to be able to make it today. So we're on to Iris Estabrook.
Hi, Hopeman Barrington, family outside.
Great. Thanks, Iris. And Barbara Tremblay.
Hi, Barbara Tremblay and Keene, husband's in the other room.
Okay. And Chris Dwyer.
Chris Dwyer, alone in my Portsmouth office.
Okay. Thanks, Chris. And Susan Heward.
Good afternoon. Alone in my office in Concord with people walking around.
Okay, great. Thanks, Susan. Val Zanchuk.
Alone in my office in Jaffrey.
All right. And Mary Heath.
Mary Heath, in Manchester, and I'm here. Might have folks walking in and out, but basically alone.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mary. And let's see, we've got folks from the car seat team. We've got Carrie Potry.
Hi, Carrie Portree here in Dover alone.
Thanks, Carrie. And we've got Jordan Hensley.
Jordan Hensley, also in Dover. My fiance is in the other room.
Okay, and we've got, let's see, is Matt on? Yep, Matt.
Yep, hi, here in Somersworth, alone by myself.
Great, thanks, Matt. And Bruce Mallory.
Bruce Mallory in Kittery Point, alone in my office.
Great. And we've got Drew Atchison from our research contractor.
Hey, Drew Atchison from AIR in Washington, D.C. with some other family around, but in the room by myself.
Great, thanks, Drew. Did I miss anybody? I don't think so. I don't know if Jen may be joining us as the meeting goes on, but Jordan, how are we looking for access?
I think we're all good.
Okay, super. And just a couple of things to note before we get started. I know there was I think at the last commission meeting, maybe one earlier than that, there was some I think some strong interest to learn more about the Massachusetts Chapter 70 plan. And many thanks to Mary Heath. She did help us reach out to Representative Alice Peisch, who is the House Chair of the Massachusetts Joint Legislative Committee on Education. And Alice sent us a really thoughtful note back, got back to us right away, and basically apologized. They're out straight right now, crunch time in the Massachusetts state legislature, and then that takes them really through the end of July, and then they all take a couple weeks off to sort of breathe and stuff like that, followed by some additional work in August. And she really offered to be able to join us in September. And while I realize that's that's really sort of getting late in the game for us, I think it would be. I think it would probably be good to be able to learn more about the master plan. Not saying we can't do that ourselves as well. We have a lot of, I think, information about it, but if the commission members want, I'll continue to work with Bruce seeing if we can schedule something. I know Dick and Bill, I think, were and maybe Chris as well, were maybe particularly interested in it. Do you want me to continue to work with Bruce on seeing if we can schedule something in September with Al Speisch, and I think he'd also suggested Aiden Church, who's their committee's research director. Yeah?
Yeah.
Try to come up with something? All right, great. We'll do that. And then the other thing I wanted to...
Dave, on that, I bet you AIR probably has some information and data with respect to the mass system. They just went through it. They may not, Drew, you may not have been directly on that that matter, but you can always ask AIR, I think.
Yeah, sure, I can look into it. I know Bruce Baker has a lot of information that he might be able to share as well.
Okay, so maybe having something even before Alice and Aiden can join us, and then we can really have some useful time, use of their time with follow-up questions, stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, we'll work on that. The other thing I wanted to talk about, and thank you, Drew. The other thing I want to talk about is late last week, we had a call with Duke Albany's, and he's with the Great Schools Partnership. And this is really a follow-up on a, well, let me step back. We'd actually tried to see if his schedule would be able to, sync up with the commission's schedule in July or August, and we just couldn't come up with a date that worked for Duke. So I had a phone call with him. It's really a follow-up on a meeting that Rick Ladd and I had with Duke last year prior to the establishment of this commission. And Duke actually had a lot of good suggestions at that time that I think we've gone ahead and put into play as part of how this commission operates and its work and its work path. So anyway, had a good sort of catching up with him, and I think it would be worth the full commission hearing from Duke. He's got a tremendous amount of experience in school funding, not just with what he's doing with the Great Schools Partnership, but while he was Commissioner of Education in our neighbor state of Maine, and had a lot of observations, or has a lot of observations on things to look for and approaches. And I think if we were able to even hear from Duke in later August or September, it would be helpful, as it would inform, I think, the commission's work. So Rick, Ladd, Rick.
Yep.
Is that fair to maybe see if we can get Duke?
Well, I think Duke would be excellent, and of course his buddy too. What is it?
Dave Roth. Yeah,
Roth would be good.
Yeah. Okay. We'll see what we can do on that. Anyway, thanks for that. Bruce, do you want to run through group agreements real quick? We're going to need them today.
Makes you say that, Dave.
Need them every day.
Let me just pop those up. Where'd they go on my, sorry, they just disappeared off of my desktop. Let me go back and grab them.
Listen, challenge, don't make it personal.
Okay, I'm going to read them off. I'm going to read them off of my desktop. Yeah, be open-minded. Yeah, as Dave says, we will need them today. This is our first chance to have a really extended deliberation session. We'll do that in a couple of different ways as we go along, but this is when the group agreements are really helpful. Keeping an open mind, listening first. It's okay to disagree, but don't personalize it. Focus on the idea, not the person. Accept working through conflict as a catalyst for learning. It's okay to put issues like race and class and other equity-related issues on the table. Be purposeful and to the point. Notice if what you're conveying is or is not pertinent to the topic at hand. I'll direct that one at myself and share that with everybody else in the commission as well. Take risks, be raggedy, make some mistakes. We'll, use thought experiments, be clumsy, because we're still, splashing our way through this jungle. And then we all share responsibility for making this a productive process today. Thanks.
Terrific. Thanks, Bruce. And we're about to jump into it, but I did want to bring up the minutes from the July 20th meeting last week. So did everybody get a chance to take a quick look at the minutes? If not, we can push these to another week. I went through them. I thought they looked good, but obviously, the meeting had a lot of presentation from Ann Edwards as well as from Anne Marie French and the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute. So I want to make sure that that we're characterizing their or capturing their comments in a fair and fair way. So is anyone giving them a look-see? Want to move forward? Is there a motion to
So moved.
Motion's been made. Is there a second?
Second. Second.
Okay, great. And motion's been seconded by Corrine and by Barbara. So any further discussion on these? Seeing none, I'll call through a roll real quick to approve the minutes from July 20th. So Luno, yes. Myler,
Yes.
Ames,
Yes.
Ladd, Rick, minutes, yep. Khan,
Yes.
Morgan,
Yes.
Ardinger,
Yes.
Bergeron,
Yes.
Cascadin.
Yes.
Let's see, Ryan with oh, and John's not here. Estabrook,
Yes.
Tremblay,
Yes.
Dwyer,
Yes.
Heward,
Yes.
Zanchuk,
Yes.
Keith.
Yes.
All right, the minutes carry. Bruce, I'm going to turn it over to you. And we
Okay,
are only 3 minutes behind schedule.
Thanks, Dave. One comment, I may have been distracted and not heard you, but Dave, did you let people know that we're also expecting to get some input from the Alliance for Public Charter Schools in New Hampshire?
Oh, right. Well, yeah, and I saw there was a late email just prior to this. Do you want to talk briefly about it, Bruce?
Sure. We've reached out to Matt Southerton, who is the president of the New Hampshire Alliance for Public Charter Schools, because clearly they play in this conversation importantly. We've heard that from school leaders and others, that we need to understand how the money flows to charter schools. We've heard reference to that relative to special education, but also more broadly, the ways in which those schools are funded. Most of us are familiar that they actually provided some revenue through a separate revenue stream the legislature established a few years ago. So in any case, we're inviting Matt Southerton to come meet with probably a work group, probably the Adequacy work group at some time in the near future. He's got some family commitments this week and I think next, so it may be a week or two out, but in any case, just let you know that that's on its way. That's another piece of the puzzle that we need to take a look at.
Great.
So, are you planning to invite anyone to speak with other perspectives on charter schools?
Say that again, Iris, I'm not sure of the question.
Are you planning to invite anyone else with other views on charter schools?
Not at this point, but I'm happy to be totally open to suggestions. I mean, we'll continue to do, and later on we'll be talking about our continued engagement work with school leaders and stakeholders and general public, and we'll get to that in just a minute, actually. So we wanted to devote, because of our extended time today, enough time to really hear from each of the work groups so that we are sort of cross-pollinating the work across the work groups, making sure they're aligned. And you have copies of brief 2 or 3 page so-called interim reports from each of the work groups. It was just sent to you within the last hour or so. So if you haven't looked at your email within the last hour, just take a look at that. You can call those up. As each chair of the work group walks us through their reports, I'm going to put them up on screen share so that you'll also have those in front of you as well, recognizing that you just received these a few minutes ago. We're allocating about 20 minutes to each of these presentations. And so part of that will be the sort of walking through the reports and then answering clarifying questions, hearing some initial comments. What we aren't able to do today, since we want to use a lot of time for other discussion today, is to deconstruct or take apart or get into deep conversations about each of the work group reports. So this is really primarily for information purposes and clarification purposes, and just taking note of how the work of these different groups is aligning at this point, at this sort of midway, somewhat midway point. So Dave, any other comments you want to make before we start with adequacy?
No, I mean, I think you hit on the, I think that's right. I know as I was putting together the report for fiscal policy work group, I was going through my notes pretty detailed and things that really stood out in my mind as well. But I may have missed something really big. So if there's, we're not really sort of, trying to nitpick these, but if something, a really big point is missing, I would bring it up and try to get it on there.
Great. So bear with us while we do these presentations. We'll have lots of chance for dialogue in the next section of the meeting. I'm going to put up the adequacy report on the screen. Go up to the top. This is the latest version. Jay, it's got your corrections in it, I believe. So I'll turn it over to Jay.
Can you go wide with that, Bruce?
Sure, I can go a little wider with that.
Great, thanks.
I don't know whether to keep up with your version or look at mine. Anyway, I'm looking at what Bruce has put up. These first objectives are what our group agreement was shared with you, I believe in April. And you may recall the debate about adding ensure a uniform and equitable design for the cost of an adequate education being added in there. But anyway, these are the 5, and I'll hopefully go through them. I think at our last discussion last Thursday, I think there's opportunity at this juncture to re-examine the importance and relative importance of these questions, given what we've discovered to date and what AIR is going to be producing for us in the future, near future. So relative to the definition of adequacy, there is now a compendium, thank you, Matt Girding, for pulling together what a number of commission members have made reference to, the number of statutes. They may be in the authorization for the Department of Education in 21. They may be in RSA for healthcare in 135 to 167. They may be in the RSAs for education 186 through 200. That compilation is available if folks are interested in seeing how many times school funding amendments have been offered and how many times the obligations that the state expects of school districts to put policies and programs in place. How many times those have been amended over time? Since 2000, I think it went back to 1998 in the court decision, and moved it forward to 2008, and then those changes that have occurred since then. But I think that we've focused a lot of attention on RSA 193. That's the Adequate Public Education Statute. And some of us, including Rick Ladd, have struggled with how complete is 193 as a definition of an adequate public education. At our last review as a committee at the AIR policy briefs, and one of those from Vermont had an approach to their public education requirements, an outline of an adequacy definition that was broader than what New Hampshire's obligations under RSA 193 are. Rick wrestled with that, and so did the committee this last week. And I think where we ended was that there may be some modifications needed to RSA 193 that could be useful to incorporate some of those additional obligations on school districts that have been added over the last 10 years. And those might include things like the requirement for a school nurse, and particularly in COVID times, this is an important element for districts. The kind of social and emotional behavioral supports and the supports that schools are putting in place, training that goes with that, as well as the external relationships for MTSSB, or multi-tiered systems of support. Food programs, which have lots of extended costs, particularly in COVID moments where they need to be meals are distributed remotely, but also the funding, sharing of funding for breakfast programs. And then we talked about career and technical education, and in particular, the matters of work-based learning and the kind of career technical education opportunities that there are for students. And Val Zanchuk has been a strong advocate in trying to indicate how important that's become in the education of students as they prepare for the workforce. So you might call these wraparound support services that are required for student success. It's the student success term that does not show up in RSA 193, as opposed to the kind of more defined part of 193, which is the curricular requirements, which have been updated more recently as we were reviewing and have pointed out. And then it's important, as we have at different times, each of us pointed to, I think it's this part of the statute in 193 that's most important. And it really, what we've discovered in 193 is that it as a whole exists to guide what an adequate public education is. And particularly as we get to the AIR analysis, it's important to note the accountability standards that are set up in the statute that are both one statute that for assessment of inputs and another statute for performance-based accountability. Okay, so just to wrap up there, we've done a lot of analysis, but it may not be that this is as compelling as a leading edge of what needs to be done in order to evaluate what is the proper distribution and source of funding for schools, public schools. as many of us, because we've done joint committee meetings on the constitutional context, I wanted to call our attention to the two parts of the New Hampshire Constitution that the court cases are wrapped around, and one is Article 5 and the other Article 83. 83 provides more guidance to what is an opportunity for public education and what the outcomes are for that. Those outcomes, promotion of the trades, and then it goes on for other kinds of occupations known in the 19th century. But I guess the point is, this is where Val Zanchek comes back to, it is the goal of a public education to prepare people for a future. So that last week's conversation with Ann Edwards may have teed up a conversation for us to continue. So often the courts are looking at what is the cost of an adequate education versus the cost of an opportunity for an adequate education. And there was that clarification that came from Ann that it is the opportunity for a constitutionally adequate education. And maybe it's that difference in opportunities that exist for students that maybe is where the commission might wish to make further contributions. And then I hearken back to that promotion of the trades, because through a presentation on career and technical education, it was pointed out how New Hampshire just has a very low engagement number around career and technical education, 9%, compared to some other states like Delaware, where the participation is up near 80%. The only financial obligations that there are that the state makes to vocational education, besides basic adequacy, is around transportation, which is necessary for districts that are cooperating with a host district on career technical education, and then on capital appropriations, which come around once every 28 years as the cycle moves. And that's been pointed out, well, maybe that's not exactly the way that this should go in the future. But the point is, there is no separate categorical aid other than for career technical education. And that is something that other states with higher participation rate, engagement rates do put categorical funding to promote. All right, we can move on to adequacy funding. So we've got a good library collected of New Hampshire studies that look at the relationship between school funding and state aid, local capacity, and student outcomes. And those exist in a Governor Shaheen report in 2002, a Governor Lynch study commissioned in 2005, and the Legislative Commission work led by then Senator Iris Esterbrook in 2008. And it's the 2008 study that has provided the foundation for base adequacy and disparity aid since that report. The New Hampshire Department of Education updates adequacy costs each biennium, that's by statute. And for the 2021 base adequacy was based on 2018 costs, and that's led to what is in the current state's allocation for base adequacy, $3,709 per pupil. In response to a inquiry from the commission, we have a preliminary 2020 estimate that would be the base adequacy cost for 2022 and 2023, the next biennium, which I I'm stabbing his numbers from recall as opposed to going back to them, but I believe it's 4340 is pretty close to the exact number. All students, all levels averaged together. So then so there's another cost update that we could be using for adequacy costs. We have the Conval et al. Lawsuit between that's now before the New Hampshire Supreme Court, which lays out a formula for updating the average cost per pupil, excluding transportation costs. And that $9,929 figure that they use has some context in the 2018 study that Rick Ladd served on a study commission to produce, and maybe other legislators that are on this commission have had some contact with that study. The differences that there are, if you try to explain the $9,900 figure and the $4,300 figure differences, are the basis of the court case. They are two different bases for determining a student to teacher ratio, and the benefits costs that need to be incorporated into the per dollar of salary for continuing staff or benefited staff that the schools employ. And then there are school operating costs that are different. So those three factors are the primary drivers for that $5,000 difference. And one of the frustration points is, as we try to verify, through the interviews that we did with the school business officers, as all of this makes sense to us, one of the things that we've been challenged to try to verify is the average teacher salary. And so while we know where teachers may, on average, be in their ranges, steps and ranges, we don't have all-in teacher salaries divided by a total number of teachers to be able to derive what is the average teacher salary in the state. So, the third-year teacher salary is around $37,000 on average, and you can put benefits to that, which is around $27,000. But anyway, it's still leaving something to be desired in establishing. So what is that average? And then we've got a third figure that AIR is told us is really very significant to their analysis. And that's that on average, if you take $3.2 billion and you divide that by the 168,000 public school students that we have in the state, you'll wind up with an average per pupil cost of $19,800. That's verified in the data from the state board. AIR has asked the need to make some determinations over the next month as to, are there parts of this $19,800 that should be isolated and treated distinctly across districts as opposed to part of the whole. And some of the places where they're going to need guidance from us have to do with these categories of special education, pre-K, transportation costs, and debt service. So, if you start to peel away too many layers to the onion, eventually we're going to get back to 4340 as the base adequacy costs. And anyway, AIR is not is going to look at the total cost and what it takes to achieve comparable outcomes at districts given their ability to raise the additional funds. So disparity aid is a part of the 2008 legislative study commission, and has been a part of the formula really for longstanding studies in the 1990s and maybe even before that. Some historian in the group will point it out probably. that there's been some form of disparity aid trying to equalize opportunities and community capacity for quite some time. We've had presentations from Reaching Higher New Hampshire, the New Hampshire Public Policy Institute, and Fair Funding New Hampshire, all of which have undertaken recent studies showing disparities that exist among towns, either within the same district or between districts. And most significant is the common observation that there are differences in the outcomes in these districts, and that relates to the median income and property valuations in those communities. So AIR's study, no doubt, will look at that. Proxies that we've seen, and you probably recall last week's presentation, but proxies that there are for the relationship to outcomes and median income might be things like free and reduced lunch, Medicaid enrollment, households under the poverty line. And each one of these data, and I think this is something that I shared with David, Mel, Bruce, and all, that we might want to dive into this, because each of these proxies have flaws with them, and we should grow to understand the flaws of relying on any one. We may have trouble finding that median income really represents disparities within a community. We may find that free and reduced lunch only applies to grades 1 through 8, and that high schools really aren't well represented in those figures. And households under the poverty line may in fact get us closer to the real underlying needs in a community. And that's what will help us determine the community's capacity on the inputs. So once we understand average costs and outcomes, what are the differing inputs and capacities of communities, and we're going to need to understand what variables we can rely on there.
Okay, I'm going to interject here. That's about 20 minutes, so maybe.
All right. I'll fly through this. All right. Then we've got kindergarten. These are special types of categorical aid that are outside the adequacy formula. We've got kindergarten that we've taken a look at. We know that public schools provide some of that, but not even not even a third of all of that. And that a report is due in 2021 that may provide more guidance as to how to fund pre-K. Special education, we know that there are multiple ways in which special education is funded, both through the disparity aid in the adequacy formula, but also through more severe case and severe need students and being mitigated by state aid. And then capital projects where the need for capital funding is probably $100 million per biennium or more. And the state right now, while lifting the moratorium, is putting only $8 million towards it in the current biennium. So continuing down, we covered just before the public charter school presentation. And I appreciate Iris's question because I think we do want to understand, and whether that's from the Department of Education, Caitlin Davis, or what are the obligations that the state and local education districts have for providing both funding and opportunities for public charter school students, whether that's for special education opportunities or co-curricular opportunities. And then, next steps, just a summative kind of comment, adequate public education definitions are probably sufficient for right now as we get into the next phase of AIR work. we may want to consider what the legislature has done to incorporate wraparound services for vulnerable populations, but we can come back to that. It's not a dependent, this is not a dependent step for AIR's analysis. And then finally, the AIR August 10th report is going to have a lot of significance for giving us insight as to how they are looking at the total spending and where the disparities are. So we'll see a regression timeline, a regression line that'll relate outcomes to community capacity and spending, and then the work group can determine, along with the tax, the fund source committees, work groups, there's going to just need to be a lot more work between those two work groups as AIR informs both on the disparity side and on the funding side. And that's there's the summary. So I'm sorry, Bruce, that I exhausted the time with just running through but we've had a lot of presentations, and I think I wanted to do justice of trying to incorporate those.
Yeah, I guess I'll just say, it seems to me a key takeaway here is that the work group is not going to spend any additional time messing with, to use that language, the definition of adequacy. It's in multiple places in the chapters and in the DOE rules. The work group believes that's a best use of its time now is to understand the costs that go into creating opportunity for an adequate education and the costs that go into producing comparable outcomes across community, regardless of community characteristics. I'm trying to sort of a high-level summary. We'd have just a couple of times for a couple of quick clarifying questions. I noticed Iris asks, how about the New Hampshire School Boards Association on Charter Schools as a suggestion? So thank you, Iris. And actually others that might have comments or questions.
Unknown caller.
Okay. Thanks. Any other immediate clarifying questions at this point? Then let's move right along then to the fiscal policy work group with Dave. Let me get that up and I'll make that a little bigger.
Okay, great. Thank you, Bruce. So fiscal policy went through and basically what I did was sort of bulleted out what I think we've settled on in terms of findings, and then where we still have some questions based on what we've heard, and then some goals and objectives over the next few months on where we hope to go or where we plan to go. After I go through this, if there's anything I'm missing, please let me know. And if there's something that where there's strong disagreement with in terms of findings, I'm not trying to get into debates on it. We can probably take it up when we go through deliberations later, either today or at a future meeting. But what I really tried laying out in findings are generally things that I think consensus of fiscal policy work group we were generally in agreement with. So if there are little things that you're not in agreement with on it, then but generally in agreement, then I think we're probably good to leave them in here. But wanted to start out with some things from our task list. What has the local education property tax? So that's not the swept part that's raised locally. This is the part that that's voted on and you're essentially voted on by your town meeting. And how's that looked over the last 20 years? Well, it's basically grown from about statewide local education property tax statewide from $555 million, which was actually 35% of the FY 2000 total statewide spending on public education, to today, just over $2 billion. So $55 million local education property tax to $2 billion today. It now represents 60% of FY19 total statewide spending on education. And if one of the questions we were asked to do was, if that 35%, if that split had been held from FY 2000 to FY19, what would the local education property tax be like today? Well, it'd be about half of that it is today. It'd be $1.1 billion, would be about 35% of the FY19 total spend. So lots changed in terms of that. We did the same exercise for the state adequacy grant, also call it foundation aid here, and that's grown from $825 million, or about 52% of the FY 2000 total statewide spending, to, it's only grown a little bit, $825 million to $915 million in 2019. But in I'm getting some feedback on somebody's speaker, so I don't know if people can mute. That would be great. So it's grown from 825 in FY 2000 to 915 million in FY19. But in FY19, that only represents 28% of statewide spending on education. So if the state adequacy grant had kept pace, or not had kept pace, had remained at 52% as it was in FY 2000, if it was still at 52% in FY19, that state aid would be $1.7 billion, the state adequacy grant. So anyway, a little bit of context there. The student enrollment statewide has decreased from FY 2001 to FY 2019, decreased from 202,000 students to 168,000 students. I think we have talked about tax equity as being a core principle of good school funding policy. And it's something that we talk about frequently. We test that assertion in the fiscal policy work group. And generally speaking, I think I see a lot of nodding heads in agreement to that. So, so that's why it's put in a finding here. Let's see. We also took a pretty strong look a couple of times at what I'm just calling the Shaheen 2000 report, but it was a commission that was put into motion by then Governor Shaheen back in 2000 to look closely and develop a uniform criteria to be able to discuss or consider various revenue sources. And I think in the committee's review of that report, we generally would say that that evaluation mostly remains true today. There may be little tweaks to it, but I think in general, there weren't any significant deviations from what we're seeing today. Let's see, performance of the most significant and non-state property tax revenues vary with economic volatility. That was one of the things that was shown in the report, and actually applies to our business taxes, business profits tax, business enterprise tax, and we're certainly seeing that now with going through the with the economic conditions the state is facing now. We also talked about our existing low and moderate income property tax relief program and how it would need to be updated for it to be useful. Even before this commission started, I know I had constituents reach out to me asking about it and expressing their frustration of its really lack of being useful, because hardly anybody really even qualifies to under the really sort of outdated income and home value provisions in that. So that would need to be updated if we were to really consider that to be part of any solution. Something that we also have talked about a couple times is currently the statewide education property tax, and how the state really arrives at that tax and implements that tax through a equalized a process of equalizing property values across the state. And I think one of the comments that was made, and you know, John's not on the call today, so I don't want to. Well, he is actually the one that made it. Is that statewide equalization of property values is fair, and that's something that it appears has changed significantly over the last couple of decades, and in a very significant way with the introduction of the DRA's mosaic system for performing that equalization. Let's see. We also learned from the DRA that land use, current use, is a statewide policy, and while current use valuations are used in the equalization of property values, different local tax credit policies are not used in that, and local tax credits that are applied at the municipal level don't change equalized property value, and don't change the amount of property tax assessed on each municipality. So locals can go do what they do on that. It doesn't change their obligation to the state. So it's come up since our very first meeting. The SWEPT, or the state property tax, is in fact a state tax. It's not a local tax, and so, you know, I just put it here because it's a key element there. This may be a little controversial, but I think we've heard substantial testimony that supports this. But the state foundation or otherwise adequacy aid that's distributed to each district must be paid by state funds. Targeted aid can be done after that. We've had several people from the state speak to this. Most recently, Ann Edwards also talked to this point, and this might be more of a goals and objectives type of thing, but as fiscal policy moves forward, we're really looking at the cost of adequacy as being something we need to raise in state funds, so it's determined for each district. But also, in addition to that, categorical aid programs. So this is building aid, special education aid, and other things that the adequacy work group might bundle into categorical aid. Certainly, we've heard about building aid and special education, and the impact those programs have on school districts, but also state funds for charter schools. That I believe is actually part of adequacy. But that's something that fiscal policy is going to need to consider, and property tax relief or property tax loan programs, and you know, we've talked about both of those. So you want me to keep going, Bruce, or take any sort of clarifying questions on findings?
You're good. You're just at about 11 minutes, Dave. So wrap this up and then we can take.
I'm at 11, or I've got 11.
No, you're at 11. You got to, you got to.
I got that was the heavy stuff there. So anyway, questions that I think are still lingering out there. So these are things we've talked about, but I don't think we've put a real fine point on it, and probably need to get a little bit more clarification. What's the argument against the statewide property tax? We've heard a lot of arguments for the statewide property tax, but there was a lawsuit back in 1999, styled Sorrell versus State of New Hampshire, and it's probably worth learning a little bit more about what was going on there. We've had a little bit of conversation about current use and the per acre value that's assessed to property that's in current use. Hasn't been updated in a long time. What would be the effect of changing that? I don't know. I don't even know how much that would move the needle, but it may be worth looking into. We don't have an answer to that yet. And how would a local tax effort, so if there was a mandatory local tax effort other than, swept, or other state revenue sources, how would that be made equitable across districts? And I think that's a question that is out there as well. We talked a little bit earlier as we got the meeting started about the Mass Chapter 70 plan, and how does that work and how does it read on the Massachusetts and New Hampshire constitutions. I think we've heard some discussion that New Hampshire has similar constitutional language as Massachusetts. I don't know that for sure, but it'd be good to understand that a little bit more. How should any sort of state property tax or SWEP be collected? I think we've heard a lot of discussion about keep collecting it or collect it the way it is, but it could alternatively be collected through the state directly, but the state doesn't have a system for that, obviously. So. Should income and or wealth be considered in fiscal capacity? Right now, our fiscal capacity disparity formula that we use as part of the state aid to schools in FY21 considers equalized value per pupil, which is a property value. So should income or wealth be considered? And is targeted aid, and I just sort of like, I don't know where this lies. Is targeted aid a fiscal policy or an adequacy distribution policy? Maybe a little or a lot of both there. So, but I'm sort of thinking of it as a fiscal policy. So anyway, and then finally, the goals and objectives, where are we going here? And I think we need to really look at developing several, and these don't have to be recommendations, but they're really policies for consideration, things that we feel generally are consistent with core principles, both in terms of equitable access and equitable taxation, and it doesn't have to be limited to 3. It could be 2, it could be 5, it could be whatever we want to do, but policy considerations that I think are useful to our what I would say are, I know all of our constituents, or everybody lives in the Granite State, but I would say particularly for policymakers, budget writers in both the governor's office, the Senate, and the House, and things that would be useful to those groups as they put forward plans for the FY 22-23 budget, which will that whole process will begin this coming January. What are these policies for tax revenue, property tax relief, and fixed income property tax loan programs? If we're, particularly if any of these policies involve, property tax, which is obviously from the findings, currently what the revenue source the state relies on for paying for public schools. Understanding the impact that each of these plans could have on residents, non-residents, and property categories and classes. So talking about, we still haven't determined the ABC property classes that Senator Gaida has referenced, but it could be residential, commercial, residential above and below certain valuations, things like that. So what's the impact on granted staters and as well as non-residents alike? And are there other policies that would tie into the fiscal work for school funding, such as the enrollment calculations, the ADMA calculation? And I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. And then having some. I think we're going to need to. And we'll need to start on this soon. The framework for bills to be introduced in the November and December filing window, and then during the budget process. So I'll need to check on, in fact, I need to check on this, and maybe Jay can check on this on the Senate side, but I believe the House normally has an extended filing window for commissions and study committees. So we may be able to avail ourselves of those extended dates. So that's what I got.
So just a couple of minutes, any quick clarifying questions? Dave?
Yep. Yeah, go ahead, Rick.
I have 3 facts I think that we've learned that support what you just said, Dave. 1, the inequity in income affects the ability of some communities to increase the dollars raised by local property taxes. So we know there's a relationship between income and the ability to raise property taxes. 2nd, local school tax rates vary significantly throughout the state, from a high of close to $24 per town, I think that might be in Brookline, to a low of 34 cents in Newcastle. So we have this really divergence in that area. The last fact I have is the decline in enrollment has contributed to increasing costs associated with providing an adequate education at the local level. So enrollment is significant. There's one policy statement that I think that kind of reinforces where Representative Luna is going with SWEP. If the SWEP, and I agree, it is a state tax, amount exceeds the cost of an adequate education plus differentiated aid, the town retains the excess. I think this needs to be looked at from both a financial perspective and from all the impacts it has as far as our being able to assist communities that need help.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Rick, and we'll try to wrap those into this report. Maybe that's something Jordan can try to fold in. And Dick, you had a hand up.
Yeah, I just repeat what Rick just got to, and that is the excess swept problem. We've discussed it repeatedly in the Fiscal Resource Committee, and you didn't directly mention it here. Whatever we want to call the swept state tax is okay with me. It carries with it an excess swept problem that described by Rick, which maybe it's Achilles' heel, and I think that it should be front and center. And then the other point is your reference to the state funding constitutional requirement that whatever's adequacy has to be paid for by the state. That is the conventional wisdom. That is there's language in the court opinions that say as much, but the context always was a situation where the state was leaving to the localities a substantial sum to be paid for off of their local property tax, whatever it might produce given their local property wealth. There's never been consideration of a different system, more like Massachusetts, that would look at the effort required by a locality to produce revenue and using that as a touchstone instead of just property wealth. So I think it's important. I think it's very important that we all understand that this is a question that needs to be explored.
Great. Thanks very much, Dick. We'll try to fold, Jordan, if you could fold some of those comments into this report too. I think that would be great. Anyway, back over to you, Bruce.
Yeah, very helpful. Thanks for that. Exactly the kind of clarifying and accuracy.
Chris had a question.
Oh, I'm sorry. I missed you, Chris. Sorry.
Just a point about something that we haven't looked at, which is the way that our state values commercial property and the potential for the legislature has never been willing to do this, but to allow the municipalities to have the adequate information to accurately value commercial property, which makes a big difference in the communities that have reasonable proportions of commercial property. And remember, commercial is not only, commercial also includes multiple family dwellings, et cetera. And so what it means is that residential is always going to be taxed at a relatively, I know by law it's the same rate, but when you don't have the right information to actually value commercial property accurately, the effect is a shift to residential, and that's something we haven't taken up yet.
Chris, thanks. So I take it from your comment there that you're talking that commercial property is being undervalued?
It has the potential to be undervalued because there's no requirement that the information be provided to assessors that would allow accurate valuation. That's come up repeatedly before the legislature and has never gotten anywhere. So you cannot require, you cannot compel information that would allow you as a municipality assessor to accurately value commercial.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Is Jen's on? If
I am.
Yeah, if that's something we can maybe pull up some past efforts to do that. I think that would be useful to the work group.
Sure.
Terrific, thank you. Any other questions while we're here?
Okay, I'm gonna keep going then.
Great.
So we'll turn to Mel and the engagement group, and let me pull that report up.
Well, all of the conversations we've had on the other two reports will ultimately have to come to some review by various groups, and that's what we're trying to do. So what we initially tried to do is to identify what key groups that we want to involve in some engagement groups, and what some of those activities might be with a review of the summaries of what that input has taken place. And so the questions that we had to deal with was, who might those stakeholders be? What are the key questions we might want to have that's going to inform the commission work? And what data do we need to share ultimately with what we've come up with as a commission? So we started in March, actually, with bringing together a group of stakeholders group. If you might want to move up there, Bruce. And we gathered them, and we got together a variety of different folks who were engaged in school issues, et cetera. And we wanted to try to figure out from them what might be some of the issues that the commission should consider. So this was really our first look at this group. And our sense is, looking ahead now to late November, to the late fall, once we've done our work, is to bring these groups back together again and to say, okay, here's what we've kind of come up with. Here was the process with which we gathered the information. And what do you think? That also goes along with the focus groups that we had in June. We must have had 12 different online programs because of the virus that hit us in March. We basically went from bringing people together physically to do that on a virtual standpoint. And we brought together, we had 12 different opportunities, over a 6-day period and we invited actually people who raised money and spent money, so that there was an idea that they knew what the issues were. They didn't really have to be educated around this. These are the principal folks who basically would establish tax rates, collect the money, and then through their own budgeting process, basically expend the money. And so we brought them together, and we had 50 people who about 50 people who were involved in these 12 different virtual groups. And you can see on the sheet here what were some of the key issues that we found from them. My intent here is not to go over these. You can read those yourselves, and you can see some of the themes that begin to come about. As a matter of fact, you'll note that some of these themes were also reflected in the work group reports that you just received. And I mean, the issue of reliance on the property tax, the inequity of the property tax, the issue of how do you deal with communities, inequities in communities that deal with rural density, how much you pay staff to try to keep continuity in staff rather than using low-paying entry wages, so to speak, get your experience and you go on to a higher-paying community. Those are some of the concerns that particularly some of the business managers were concerned about. Then as we begin to go, beginning now, we had our first public engagement session this past year. I mean, David's done, I think, a good job in trying to get, allow people to have input for the commission. We had that on the 15th. We had 20 people that attended. Again, this was an online activity. 10 people spoke. Again, here's a list of what the speakers, the topics that the speakers basically talked about. Again, you begin to see some very consistency in the feedback that these folks are giving. We also have several more open public engagement events like this taking place in each month, so that we can continue to gather that input on an ad hoc basis. Then in late July, we did a school employee survey, and this was kind of a shot in the dark, because we wanted to get input from employees, but we weren't quite sure what the timing of that would be, and so we checked with various interest groups, and they said clearly do it at the end of the school year, because if you don't do it then, you're not going to get them over the summer, and as you begin to start the school year, that's going to be a delay. So we conducted this survey from I think it was for about a 10-day period in July. We stopped the survey entry into the survey on the 10th of July. We're currently in the process of analyzing that data. Now, it's very important to note that we had almost 2,000 people engage in this survey. My hope was, my personal hope when we were pulling this together was if we could get 1,000, based upon the time of the year, et cetera. And I was pleased with 1,768 responses. The survey has a lot of open-ended questions in it. And so the developing the analysis of the data is time-consuming as we begin to look at keywords, key phrases that continue to come up. And we will also provide for the commission when we report this out, also a demographic analysis of, because this was any employee, whether it was a superintendent, food care worker, a teacher, a counselor, there are all kinds of employee categories that were in this, and the work group was very good in making sure that I think we had a full coverage of anyone who had worked in a school had an opportunity to check off their particular response. So that demographic will be available. Now, as we begin to look at our next steps, we're engaged because we do want to have to try to get student voice. This is a little more daunting because the presumption is that some students will understand the issues of school funding, and so as we begin to look at these issues, there obviously as we approach students to give them a background of what it is, and then what the impact of school funding is on their life in school. And we plan to do this in the fall. Again, not quite sure what the fall is going to look like yet, but that is our intent. And that's to deal with both high school and college students. Obviously, Susan's got some real good ideas on how to deal with accessing community college students, et cetera. Then immediately what we have facing us is the next item, and that is the Granite State poll out of the UNH Survey Center. We can have up to 10 questions, and we will be bringing to the commission some of those questions. The survey actually hasn't asked questions about school funding since 2002. So we've got those old questions, and based upon the reports you've heard from the two other work groups, we're in the process of trying to identify what those questions might be. This is a survey that they do on a quarterly basis around the state, and so the initial draft of these questions needs to be in by the middle of August, and we will have at least a draft of some of the questions and the area of the questions for the August 10th commission meeting. Further on in October, obviously, we do plan to, these haven't been set up obviously yet, but we do plan to host meetings using the executive council districts as a guide to open up for the public some of the findings that we have been working with, and to test those findings with them and get their feedback on what we're planning to do. And along with that, we also hope to deal with a special group in dealing with older adults, 65 plus, to get their feedback. Obviously, they've got grandkids in schools, their children have gone through, but this will be an opportunity to deal with them. And then, as I mentioned earlier, to bring back together the municipal and school leaders to look at the work of the commission's recommendations. So that's where we are right now. Any members of the work group, did I miss anything? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Bruce.
It looks good. So there you have it. As I said to this group earlier today, having this kind of report in such concrete on the page format is a reminder that a lot has been done. We are shifting, as we say, from sort of the fact-finding and definitional phase of the commission's work to honing in on what the key questions and variables are, and then this will all be complemented, of course, by the cost modeling that AAR will be presenting to us at the full commission, the next full commission meeting 2 weeks from today on August 10th. So we're just about on time and not doing too badly, a few minutes over. We're going to shift now into 2 rounds of smaller group conversation using the limitations that the webinar platform provides us. We can't break into our simultaneous small groups. So we'll do 2 consecutive rounds of what we'll call a fishbowl. There'll be about half of the commissioners in each of these rounds. We've asked your 3 work group chairs and leaders of the commission, Dave and Nell and Jay, to be listeners through both of these rounds of conversation rather than participants. Our goal here is to be sure that everybody has equitable time, particularly those who perhaps have been a little bit quieter over the last few months and haven't had a chance to jump in because we've got others who are always right there. So I'm going to try to create some equal time opportunities here for reflecting on the key questions that are moving us through this design thinking process. And the agenda that we distributed earlier has those questions on them. What we're going to do is organize the first small group. And Carrie, I'm going to ask you as co-host to turn off the screen views for the people that are not in the fishbowl. So the only faces appearing on the screen will be those of the people who are involved in the conversation itself. I'll be facilitating the first group and Carrie will be facilitating the second group. So listen carefully because I'm about to pull you into the first group. If we were in a room together, I would physically be setting up chairs in a circle in the middle of the room while the rest of you are on the outside of that circle. So Dick Ames and John Morgan and Jane Bergeron and Iris Estabrook and Barbara Tremblay and Chris Dwyer, we're inviting you to move your chairs into the center of the room. And I'll say that again, Dick Ames, John Morgan, Jane Bergeron, Iris, Barbara, and Chris are in group one, round one. So while you're organizing your chairs and Carrie's closing out screens, this first group will address 3 questions in its 20-minute conversation. Again, those are listed on the agenda. What are the core elements of the problem that we're addressing? From where you sit right now and with the hats that you currently wear, keeping your constituents in mind. And by constituents, I mean the sector that you represent, the people that may have elected you to office, the networks that you hang out in. You know, remember that you were chosen to be on this commission for a particular purpose. It was not a random invitation. You have particular expertise, knowledge, and experience, and you sit in specific places in our state that gives you particular insight into the questions that we're addressing. So as you think about these questions, what are the core elements of the problem? What constituent groups are most impacted by the problem from where you sit? Who is it that you hear from? Who is it that you are, whose concerns are you trying to take into account as we go through this process? And how does the impact of this work vary by those different groups that you're in contact with? And then third, why haven't previous efforts at solving this constitutional and fiscal and political problem worked or been sustained? So I think over the past several months, we've looked at historical efforts to examine definitions of adequacy, the way that we cost and fund adequacy, the way we distribute funds out to local communities, the way that we collect funds from local communities, the way we hold communities, districts accountable for delivering an adequate education. Why does this commission have to exist? What is it that we need to be aware of to not fall into whatever previous traps or roadblocks experienced in previous efforts to solve the problem? So again, those questions are on your agenda, so I don't need to repeat them too much. I'm going to start by asking each of the 6 of you to just jot a few notes to yourself. I'm going to give you a couple of minutes around those 3 questions. Just write a few things down to collect your thoughts. And then we're going to go around the fishbowl and give each of you, excuse me, about 3 minutes to share your thoughts, to share your jottings around all 3 questions. You may completely ignore one of the questions if it's not so interesting to you and spend all of your thoughts, all of your allotted time on 1 or 2 of the questions. That's fine. You can also pass, although I'll encourage you to participate. And then at the end of that round robin, having heard from each of the 6 of you, this group, this small group, will take a few minutes to reflect on what you heard from each other. What stood out for you? What struck you as interesting or unusual or particularly critical or important? So that's the process we're going to be going through. I'm going to stop there and again, give you just another minute to gather your thoughts before we begin the round robin. Who am I missing? It looks like we lost John Morgan. I guess he had to duck out. So the five of us, we each get a little bit more floor time. Okay. I'm just going to simply go by first name alphabetical order here when I call on you, just to give you a heads up. So Barbara, you're going to be teed up here in a second, followed by Bill. I'm sorry, Bill's not in this group. Followed by Chris, obviously.
I missed Bruce. Who are you starting with?
Barbara, and then Chris. And then Dick, you'll be after Chris. Just again, just first name alphabetical here.
Okay.
What's that, Barbara?
Yes, I am. I have a small list of things. I'm sure we all have the same list, but the whole idea of the definition of an adequate education or opportunities for an adequate education, what does that mean? What does that, we have the list in 193 of some of the elements. We know that that list has changed over the last 12, 13 years, and it continues to change as the whole process of education is so dynamic. And as we learn how students are learning and what their needs are. So that to me is one of the elements. We talk about costing of adequate education, but we still have to remember what is that going to be, even if we go with a larger definition of adequate or a new word or whatever. The second piece for me is equity and equitable opportunities for all of our students. And that to me seems to be one of the things that is lacking across our communities and our state, and something I would really like us to consider. That of course goes along with cost and distribution of funds, how that is done, how we raise the funds and how we distribute the funds. And what are those? Are they a state tax? Are they a property tax? Is there something that we might come up with as we are working with AIR and other, as we look through the historical perspective over the last 15, 20 years that we've been working on this. But distribution and the cost is something very important to me. And how this is all working together. As we went through the 3 reports today, which was excellent, by the way, those 3 reports to help us in our thinking. To think about the cost factors, equitable opportunities, how we're going to do that across as we look at all of our districts and how varied they are. You know, I happened to be superintendent in 2 districts. One was a regional with 5 towns, and one was an SAU with 7 towns, all very different. And how are we going to do that to be more equitable across the districts, whether they're a part of an SAU or not, and how we're going to be equitable across the state. Those are very important factors for me.
So Barbara, you're really kind of stuck with that first question, and I invite anybody to address any of those questions. Any quick comment about the other 2 questions, Barbara, at all?
Oh, yeah, sorry. The constituent groups in the second group, of course, being an educator, I'm always going to start with our students, meeting the needs of our students, the learning opportunities, the social emotional concerns for our students, making sure they do have equitable opportunities. That is always, I believe they're the ones that are most directly impacted, of course, by the problem. Other than going out from our students, our children, we look at staff, all areas of staffing, We then go out further and we look at our communities, the taxpayers in our communities, how each community is affected by our school system and part of our school system. And then from there, we go out to the state. I don't see it in that order, but students will always be first for me. So that's where I've got to land. And previous efforts, I have various thoughts, and I'm going to be careful what I say here, but I think many things have been tried over the years. I know Iris has done so much work over the years. I've watched and heard her over the years. I always am concerned about the political aspect of why things do and do not work. And I think we have been very careful how we have or have not addressed that. So I'm just going to put that on the table.
Good. Thank you, Barbara. Thanks.
Okay.
And just moving right along to Kristen.
Sure. Why don't I start with the third question so that we'll, some of us will get there. Which is why previous efforts haven't worked. You know, the ability of taxpayers to pay hasn't been addressed. Inflation hasn't been able to be put into, taken into account. The weights for special populations weren't really empirical, and outcomes weren't taken into account related to the weights. High cost differentials like transportation, small schools, concentration of poverty have not been a part of the targeted aid. And to me, the way a statewide requirement is identified and put into place really masks the problems. It kind of fakes a solution and confuses the public. And so I don't think that people have really ever understood what that statewide property tax is. And I think it really has masked a potential solution. When I think of constituent groups, kind of moving backwards in the questions, I agree with Barbara. My whole list is all about students with one exception. And it's you know, students in small school districts where there isn't a critical mass. It's students who are English learners, low-income students, students in rural areas. Those families living where there are high concentrations of need. And residential property owners whose income hasn't kept up with the increase in property value, and that's going to be true wherever they live. So when I back up to question one in core elements of the problem, the general pressure from high property taxes, because it's our base, because schools are the biggest component, whether you're in a city or in a small town, of taxes. It's really created serious divisions in community that's reflected in voter revolt. It's reflected in new against old, you know, young against old. And I think it again obfuscates the potential for a solution. A different slice of a core element of the problem, there really hasn't been pressure or incentive for reaching economies of scale in our state. And so the costs of education are inordinately high in New Hampshire and the rest of New England compared to how they are in other parts of the country. That just compounds some of these other problems. And, you know, as many people have said, we have no meaningful relief for low-income homeowners. And another core part of the problem is we've had insufficient allocation of resources for concentration of need. So that has also exacerbated even the targeted aid that we do have. That's my list.
Great, thank you. 3 minutes just about on the button. Very concise, thank you. Let's see, Dick, next.
Sure. Well, big task here. And I feel enriched and humbled at the same time by being part of a panel that includes people with such strong educational background, experience, and commitment. So I start with the core elements of the problem. I start with defining adequacy. I don't think that's as big a problem as it may seem. We've had discussions of that. We've learned about that from the report of the Adequacy Work Group. I think it's it's all there, and we can make judgments about it, and we don't need much more, maybe some tweaking. The big problem comes in costing it out, and that's at the core of our undertaking, I think, costing it properly. And in turn, jumping down to one of the reasons perhaps that there's been such failure to resolve this issue is that the cost, there's a temptation to dumb down the cost in order to get to a point where you can pay for it with state money. And that's a perilous course. You get into all sorts of trouble when you do that. You lose support. And you're trying to defend a formula that is hard or impossible to defend. Witness the Conval case right now. Very difficult situation. I think keeping our eye on the ball and getting that adequacy cost right is absolutely essential. That's easy to say. We've got lots of people to help us do that. There are probably many different ways to approach a result there. I'm open to all of them. I'm no expert, but it's got to be a credible outcome. That's what my bottom line. If it is, I'll support it. If it's an attempt to reach a preset number, I won't. It's as simple as that. And then I wanted to underscore that still leaves paying for it. How are we going to pay for it? And the scary part about defining adequacy in a credible way is that it raises the cost beyond what we have in statute today. And so how do we pay for it? And there's going to be a gap. And I don't have an answer to that. It's why I've been raising questions about moving to a different system similar to Massachusetts, where they're doing pretty well by their foundation formula, but they look to localities for what they call a minimum local required, mandatory minimum local contribution. Which is really the inverse of our SWIP. Through that, through an effort component that's built into that, they've figured out a way to get significant input from localities, which I think is appropriate. It's a buy-in, it's a participation in the undertaking that you don't get if it's all state funded. And I think there's a way of getting to a point where it's constitutional in New Hampshire. So I'm going to be looking hard at that, and I've said that a few times, so I guess I'm getting tiresome on that point. In terms of constituents, I've got lots of constituents, from all walks of life, from all professions, and kids to the very old. And so I'm trying to please them all, I guess. I want to get to a good result, and they'll support me if we get to a good result, including the revenue feature. I'm absolutely convinced of that. I hope that the rest of us can all approach it that way. If I were living in Manchester, I'd feel that the current system is not supporting my kids. The funding for the kids in Manchester is very low, and particularly low when you look at need, at the characteristics of the kids there. If there's any place in New Hampshire where education is below adequacy, I'm not talking about funding issues, taxpayer inequities, and so forth, I'd say that Manchester rises close to the very top of that. And that's where our minority kids are, our low-income kids are in the greatest concentrations. So that worries me a lot. We've got to get to a better place. My comments.
No, great. Thanks. I'll call time on that. Gave you a little bit extra too. Iris, you're next up.
Okay. Question 1, core elements. Core element is the educational disparities around the state. and how we can impact that with state policy as we express it in costing and distribution formulas. Another core element for me, as I've said many times, are the court rulings, especially the Londonderry case, which we refer to as first and last dollar, and how we deal with that without dumbing down. And the third core element is revenue restrictions. I would skip ahead to the last question about why things haven't worked. And to me, it's all about the money. It's all of the changes that have been made to what had been adopted were not made for education policy reasons. They weren't made to improve anything. They were made to save money. And I appreciate that Barbara put out there that it's political. It's totally political. And it's totally political about the spending of money and the raising of money. And I don't know how you get around the general unwillingness I've seen of people to raise the overall spending on education, or the general unwillingness to decrease spending for my particular district or districts, which is the whole reason we've been living with stabilization for so long. We didn't want to spend the money to let people get what they were supposed to get, but we didn't want to take the consequences of having people's amounts drop. And that's the essence of why things haven't worked in my mind. It's not because we haven't understood the problem. So, and then who are the constituent groups that are impacted with this? Well, clearly it's kids. I'd say it's teachers too, especially in schools with limited opportunities. And I love the way Jay earlier started to have us start to think about this as a difference of opportunity. And I think it does vary by group, but it varies within those groups. And I think as Dick said, you know, there are all kinds of constituent groups. School boards are impacted in their ability to create programming that they know is needed in their districts. Taxpayers are impacted by the decisions that are made about where the revenue is coming from. So that's my stark take on reality, and love to see where we go from here.
Good. Thanks, Iris. Very clear, to the point. And finally, Jane in this group.
Well, my notes echoed many of the same things that have already been raised when it comes to question number 1 around the core elements of the problem. The first thing that came to mind for me was the definition of adequacy, and that we make sure that it's current, it's up to date, and reflects the diverse needs of our educational communities in New Hampshire. You know, kind of aligned with that is just the disparity and equity in terms of our educational communities, and the need for us to make sure that all kids have the same kind of learning opportunities. And I loved Iris's comment about changing the culture of the state, and how do we shift that thinking, and emphasizing the importance of funding education, and how to best do that. In terms of question number 2, constituent groups, my mind went directly to kids, especially students in marginalized populations, such as your low-income students, your kids with disabilities, your English language learners, who definitely don't have the same and equal opportunities across the state. The other bin of students that I thought of are those with mental health challenges, and we're seeing that huge population of kids growing, and we don't have the resources and supports to deal with them. We touched a little bit about early childhood education and how they're being impacted, especially when it comes to kids with disabilities and not having the fund for that very specialized population of kids. And then the third question, why haven't previous efforts been worked on or sustained? I would agree that it's the ability of the residents to pay. Our property taxes are so high. We've got an aging population. And so, just the rising costs, especially when you think about special education, the continued rising costs and the diminished funding that we see at the federal level as well as state levels, really has created even more problems in that area. So those were my notes.
Good, thanks, Jane. So just take a few minutes here, and I'm interested to hear you all reflect on what you just heard. What struck you as interesting or common across from this small group that we just shared these ideas on? Several of you even said things like, well, my notes reflect what I just heard, but what stood out for you in terms of what we just harvested? Yeah, Chris.
Well, one thing, I think it's something for us to reflect on. I know there is a sense that there isn't the will out there. On the other hand, the averages show that it's about $19,000 a pupil is being raised. Now, I know that that's not distributed equally, but if you think of the money that's being raised in our state per pupil compared to what's being raised in other places, there clearly is some will. It's whether the will is all at the local level and whether there hasn't been will at at the state level is a different question. But clearly we have plenty of pockets in our state where people have been able to put the money there. And so that suggests to me that this might not be an insolvable, intractable problem, because we already have a good chunk of the state that's clearly supporting education.
Interesting. Good. Others?
Well, they weren't very happy to share under the quote donor town system. So I think there's some issue of how you get that redistributed. Dick, sorry.
Oh.
Dick, go ahead.
No reason to be sorry. You should have kept going. Two things. One is I thought back about what we all had said. One word that I hadn't heard and I didn't think of was accountability. And I think any system that we go forward with has to have provisions for accountability in it. I think that's part of the task. Whatever that means, and all of you can help figure that out. And then the other thing is just to respond about this pessimism that may develop that this is all insolvable. I just want to say that I don't feel that way. I think it's solvable. I think it's a very difficult problem politically. It's a difficult problem. I think structurally it's difficult too, just to figure out how to solve it. But we've got a good group here. It's a serious group. We've got lots of time. That's a joke. And let's see if we can't take a big step in the right direction.
Any other thoughts before we wrap this up and I turn it over to the next group? Great. I appreciate both the optimism and the complexity of the comments that are reflected here. But it's good to hear each of your individual voices on this. So, some of you have had a chance to sort of emphasize similar themes, and others have had less opportunity. So this was a healthy way to hear from each of you. So Carrie, I'm going to turn it back to you. And actually, Carrie, I'll go ahead and invite the other folks to pull their chairs into the center of the room. I'll go ahead and take care of the screens as you settle into your facilitator chair for round two. So it's obviously Rick and Bill and Corinne and Susan and Val and Mary will be in this next group. So let's, I will open up these screens here.
Hi, everybody. So as the next group comes into the circle, Rick, Bill, Corinne, Susan, Val, and Mary, I'm again going to remind everybody to think of who are joining this small group to think about the different hats that you wear in the community and your role here on the commission. And so as you answer these questions, to think from multiple points of view. Again, we're going to take 2 to 3 minutes to jot down notes you have for each question, and then you'll each have 3 to 4 minutes to respond to the group, as does the group before you. As your fellow fish bowlers, as Bruce and I refer to you, are talking, please feel free to take notes as well, because again, we'll open it up for about a 10-minute discussion for the small group afterwards. Just be aware of how much time you're taking up. I'll also be keeping track of time, so be ready for me to ask you to sum up your thinking after 3 to 4 minutes. So let's take those couple minutes, 2 to 3 minutes, to jot down your notes about the 4 questions. They are, or the 3 questions. They are: what components of the problem are most malleable, easiest to address? What components are the most complex, most difficult to address? And what components are the most intractable? So just take a few minutes.
Gary, this is Bill. I had written down my notes in a form that I could share at my point. It'll also make sure I go through it quickly. So if that is possible, that'd be great.
Okay. I am going to ask Jordan.
He's good. You should be able to share.
Okay, Bill, you're good. Jordan has spoken.
Thank you.
And we will take our break at the end of this round. So in about 30 minutes or so, I'll have a chance to stretch and break and then reconvene for a big meta conversation. And I'll mute myself.
Oh, Val is there. It's about 1 more minute. Okay, so I've set my timer on my phone, so you may or may not hear a beeping. If you do hear a beeping, you'll know your time's up. I'll also try to give you a little warning. So let's start with Mary, if you're ready, Mary.
Okay, well, the easiest to fix, I think defining the issues. I think we've really worked hard on that, and we have to look at how the state tax could be used differently, and I think that's an area that it also has its big issues, but it's something that could be an avenue. What else would be the easiest to fix? We know that there is an enthusiasm across the state to increase the manner in which we fund schools and accountability and the degree to which we support that effort. I think there's huge support on both sides. It's just coming together to figure out how to do it, and nobody can agree on how that can happen. So I think the most difficult, politics gets in the way. I think we continue to see again and again, no one is willing to talk about different forms of revenue. We get stuck every single election. I worry right now about our conversations and somebody taking the conversation and saying, oh, that school funding commission wants to raise taxes. And then it becomes a political football, and then we end up in different places. The other thing, I think there are a lot of things that have been built into the law. We have a lot of statutes that have hidden costs. And, you know, I talk about the charter school, and that the special ed costs have to be borne by the LEA. And I think that in some places, like my own city, is significant. And I think it's something that we have to look at. Every single time we pass another bill that requires another program, that's something, and I think we really need to do a good review of the statutes that we have that inadvertently go back to causing more direct costs to the local school district. Just the overall conversation about the difficulty in revenues, just going through what we went through with the Finance Committee this year, and looking at something like possibly a capital gains tax, which seems like a very logical and way to really look at fairness in terms of how to raise some revenue for our state. And just people don't want to consider anything. And we seem to be stuck in this world of inability to consider something different. And at the same time, across the state, we have children that are receiving, I think Dick Ames explained it very nicely, we have school districts that have an extraordinary level of education. Their assessments really support that. And we see the kinds of activities, you know, just spending a day in different school districts, you certainly see the difference. And then coming to a place like Manchester. Manchester is so limited and so stressed. We have the highest level of diversity in our state. We have a tax cap that has kept us from really investing in education, and the overall really support for education that should be there is just, it seems to be a mixed and political issue. Oh, the most intractable, oh, that's one that's really hard to talk about. We really need to change what we're doing. Our current way that we fund schools is so unfair. I look at what Berlin's doing, and it just seems to make so much more sense to do what Massachusetts is doing, so that we're really looking at the ability to pay, and the support that we provide goes along with that. Again, I go back to what David said about we're spending on an average, $19,000 per student across our state right now. However, we say across our state, that means that in some places like Manchester, we're spending $14,000, and then in another school district, we're paying over $20,000 per student. So, I mean, those are things that I think we really need to figure out how to make what we're doing. I think that has to be something that we have to hold tight to, is how do we make this whole thing more fair?
Okay, Mary, I'm gonna stop you there. And you can interject some thoughts in just a little bit after everyone else has a chance. Thank you so much. How about Rick?
Thank you. I can will some of my time back to Mary. No, I think in looking at that first question, there are some of the easier components of this problem to address. The study which we did back in 2018 was really definitive in one of its recommendations. Get rid of hold harmless, get rid of stabilization. I think we're all agreeable to that. And I don't think we need to revisit that component of our formula. Another component which had agreement from all that were there was increase base adequacy for all students and increase differentiated aid for students eligible for free or reduced price lunch. we all recognize if we're going to stay with the components of base adequacy in this format, we're going to have to take a real stiff look at all those elements and look at, is the PTR ratio of grades 3 through 12 30-to-1 relevant? No, it's not. But you know, if we're going to start chopping down, let's say even the K through 2 to 20-to-1 and the upper grades 3 through 12, if you want to lump them together, I wouldn't lump them together. Just to knock them down by 5 persons per class would cost us somewhere around $60+ million. Where do you come up with the capital to do this? So I think that there are a lot of issues of ways around things. We talked about weighting of the amount of funds which go based upon the number of free and reduced kids you have, the number of special ed kids, size of your school. I think weighting is a good way out, and I don't think it's going to be that difficult. The most complex issues I think we're dealing with is we don't really have a clear definition of adequacy. And I am a real advocate that we can't make a laundry list of social studies and history and government and mathematics. They're all important. But what about what I wrote down earlier, offering flexible pathways for learning progression and workforce readiness? What about career technical education and vocational education as being a component, a criteria of what an adequate education is? We want kids to apply learning. There's no better way of doing it than working with business and doing that. So I think that that's a very complex issue which we have to address. The other issue that I think that has to be looked at in terms of difficulty is we're so used in the state of looking at how we fund in a per capita basis. And with declining enrollments, we just can't continue like that. So how are we going to define base adequacy? Is it going to be programmatically? And maybe how we distribute money is based upon the ability of that particular community to provide the program which is adequate for that community. And again, we're fighting this issue of local control. And most of the difficult problem is being in the legislature, nothing is easy. It's all political. It's all political. I see Mary shaking her head up and down agreeing. Yes, it is political. And there's a lot of political actions occurring where folks sometimes have to walk a different drummer than they actually believe in. So what we have to do is reflect upon what our communities are telling us right now. We have these disparities. We have these inequities. They're widely thought of throughout our state. Let's start thinking that and doing that. And one of the most intractable issues, I think, is that funding special ed, free and reduced, and all these characteristics we've talked about in the weighting is not going to be that difficult. We understand that process. But we have an organization and structure of education in this state. SAUs. There's absolutely zero funding of SAUs. There is...
Final thoughts, Rick.
Every SAU is expected to provide the same type of programming, irregardless whether it has 500 students or 1,500 students. And then we have this efficiency business where we can't, it's more difficult and costly for the small districts to support this. So I think trying to change the structure of how we organize education in our state is a huge problem. I don't know if we're going to be able to accomplish it in this commission. Thank you.
Thanks, Rick. Let's move on to Susan.
Thank you. In terms of the problems that are most malleable and easiest to address, a couple of the formulas that we've looked at, I would call formulas that count things. And if we put some things into those formulas that we currently don't, like school nurses, mental health services, early childhood education, those are things that have years of research of their effectiveness behind them, but we don't do them at this moment. So I would love to see more of an emphasis on things that we can do to improve circumstances for all of our students and also outcomes. When we look at the districts that really put a lot into assessment and a focus on outcomes, we see good outcomes. And I do think I'm an optimist about that piece. I think that we can address that under some of the formulas that have been suggested. In terms of the complexities, for me, it's about poverty, parity, and opportunity. We have some real unevenness economically across our towns, and it plays out in our school systems. And you know, how you address that is larger than the schools. What can we do for workforce development for the adults and so on, in addition to kids? Special education, I look at the Manchester School District and see how it is crushed under the expense of special education. And even if we come up with a formula or an approach, which I certainly hope we do, it's still going to be a huge problem for Manchester and any number of districts. I will raise, as Rick has, the whole workforce readiness and CTE. I mentioned opportunity. For me, if I look at what is our opportunity to help each child succeed, in some cases it's special education, in some cases it's career readiness, in other cases it's ELL. There's nothing about how we currently do business that gives us an opportunity to look at the desired outcomes for a child and to provide for that. In terms of intractability, I would have to comment on social conditions and local control. I mean, certainly urban poverty is in there, but schools' ability to address the issues that children bring into the school really make it very difficult for problems to be solved. Money is a wonderful piece, but so many of the issues that our kids face are not addressed by throwing money at it. Because we have such an emphasis on local control, I think we miss opportunities to really look at ways to effectively educate. And you've all persuaded me that the political part of this makes it very, very difficult. And thank you, Gary.
Great, thanks, Susan. Val, you're next.
Well, I think, you talk about the components are most malleable or easiest to address. I think all the components can be addressed in a compelling narrative. And I'm not sure, we've gotten into lots of the weeds here, but when we go out back to the world here, I think, especially as we're engaging the community, we need to tie all this together in such a way, without getting into the details, that we can get agreement or awareness of a problem narrative that without trying to solve it right away, where people can say, okay, yes, that makes sense. I understand that this is something that we can all agree with. And we realize there are many components that are involved with that, but and we hear it coming back from the public about their specific issues, but we need a story, I think, that really pulls it all together, so that without getting into differences about how to solve the problem, we can get some, coalescence around an agreement. Okay, this is the situation. I know everyone has specific local issues with, their regional, local educational system, but we're a state commission, so we should be talking about the state's compelling interest in resolving this problem and how it relates, especially from the employer's perspective, of the inequities of education end up being inequities in workforce. That we have people who are well prepared and we have people who are not well prepared. And I think it's an incredible waste of the lives of all of our students that we're not preparing them equally for the opportunities in the workforce. And when we have businesses in the state just aching for well-trained, capable employees, not all of them have to be college educated, but seeing that certain areas put out great students who are ready for work, other areas don't. And unfortunately, if your business happens to be in one of those areas that doesn't have that kind of preparation, you're out of luck. You know, you're not going to be bringing people from, you know, Exeter up to, you know, Berlin to work in your factory. I mean, you should be able to create a workforce locally. So I think, to me, there's a narrative that we really need to make compelling. Obviously, the components that are complex and difficult to address are the ones that tie the educational equity to the financial or taxation equity, trying to get those two together. And I would agree that the intractable part of this is the local control, that there's a tremendous conflict between the perception of local control and then all the complaints about the costs. And part of the cost problem is tied so much to this concept of local control that to solve this as a state, there needs to be less perception of local control and more perception of a universal or statewide solution to the problem. And I think getting people to start thinking in terms of themselves as citizens of the state, as opposed to citizens of a specific community, is going to be a tough thing. Because I think in the end, that's how we're going to fix this problem. If there's a political way of getting to that, is to get people to think about the state and the needs of the state as opposed to their individual community. And I think if we broaden that, then the taxation issues and everything else get smoothed out. But again, that is a very difficult political position to be in. And I think going back to the last set of questions, the failure of so often is good intentions get diluted over years through progressive legislative chipping away at ideas. And then you end up with politically viable solutions that don't solve the educational problem, which is why we have this commission again. So it's a tough situation.
Okay, thank you, Val. Will be Corrine and then Bill, and then we'll have 10 minutes of conversation. Then we will take a break before we gather back together. So Corrine.
Thank you. Oh, I agree with so many things. What components of the problem easiest to address? I hate getting stuck in the weeds, and I don't understand why we can't maintain, or maybe we could maintain those parts of the formula that work. The disparity aid, somebody spent a lot of time to develop those categories. They're working. What's not working is the amounts of base adequacy, obviously, and the amounts in those categories. I think, I'm not sure what, I think adequacy was one of those items that the courts deemed unconstitutional, and it sounds like this commission is well on its way of being able to satisfy that, I hope. What I really don't understand is when costing out adequate education is we keep going over all of these different categories, but yet schools are required to provide all of the minimum standards. So I don't understand it. Why aren't we costing out what minimum standards are to implement? Because we're required to do those. Maybe somebody has that answer. I don't know. I think also moving forward with some of the recommendations of the past study commissions, because a lot of people have spent a lot of time on this. And I think the most complex or difficult is definitely the legislative support to address the revenue problem. I think agreements on what is adequate education is not that complicated. The issue with the political climate is there is not full support of public education. And of course, over the last 10 years, definitely early childhood has come into play that we're not addressing, preschool, facility upgrades. I mean, just what I think, thank God I don't have to worry about HVAC systems in 100-year-old buildings right now, because that's a huge challenge for people. We know that career and college and career readiness are new indicators, and I can't speak enough to using that as an outcome measure because it has to be measured. And what I'm disheartened about is I discovered that with all the regional CTE centers, different local school districts have requirements of those centers in a different way. So you'll have more kids prepared for careers versus college than in some areas than you will in others. But I don't know if there's a way to standardize that. The most intractable is definitely the political climate. I think if the results of this commission could be really moved in the sense that education is the #1 investment for sustaining New Hampshire's economic base and work, live, and play. I mean, you have to invest money to reap a benefit. And if the state wants to keep its kids here, then they need to spend some money in it. And the revenue is a big, big issue. And I really like the Vermont model because it had 1/3 from the general fund, 1/3 from educational property taxes, and 1/3 from individual local property taxes. Now, I don't know what that would look costing out, but really going back to the previous questions, I mean, the whole problem is the burden on the local property taxpayer and the inequities of students around the state. I did come across in California, they changed a term that changed a complete mindset. And maybe that's something we should think about. Instead of identifying at-risk students, which have a negative connotation, they changed their terminology to at promise so that it had a more positive tone to it, and calling kids that had promise and providing all the supports for the at promise kids. And it just got me thinking that that's, you know, definitely not the answer here, but I mean, the social emotional issues and mental health issues have exploded in the public schools, and we're not providing funding to address any of that to make those kids successful. So the political climate, and definitely there has to be a revenue source, and that's what we're lacking. The other stuff, I think, you know, that there's enough smart people around the commissions, the legislature, or around the state that can really come up with what is an adequate education. And, you know, what does the state require as they continue to provide unfunded mandates, you know, and the cost of special ed. We have to pick up that slack because the federal level never delivered what they promised to deliver either. So, and I can't imagine what that's going to look like after kids try to get back to normal from, you know, the coronavirus situation. But I think the push is to get all kids college and career ready. And I
Karina,
think
I'm gonna have us move on to Bill. Thank
okay,
you so much.
I could go on, but definitely revenue.
Thanks.
All right.
Okay, and are you seeing my screen there, my share for my notes?
Yep.
Okay, so I'll go quickly through this. My preliminary comment at this halfway point on the commission is that we've been lucky as a commission to take a deeper dive into the complexities of public school system. It's very complex. It's tax policy, it's education policy, it's a school funding formula. And we've been lucky to do that. And we're also luckier than the past efforts in New Hampshire because we have access to a nationally recognized school finance consultant, AIR, who, as you know, hasn't really spoken yet. And they will be speaking in the second half. I'm very much looking forward to, because our prior efforts have been homegrown. And those efforts don't have the benefit of outside the silo. I wanted to take a deep breath and start with 4 facts. People have mentioned it. We have one of the highest quality public education systems in the nation. We're ranked that way by education. So it's pretty good on average. New Hampshire's ranked as one of the top 10 highest per pupil spending states. Again, on average. New Hampshire is ranked as one of the bottom 5 states in terms of distribution to poorer towns. That is a direct distribution and equity issue. And New Hampshire has the lowest state financing percentage in the nation. We have 31.3% compared to Mass, who's ranked 45th at 38. Those facts are important to remember when you start picking out, you know, what is the problem, the core problem. This is the graph that got me in our materials. New Hampshire is 5th from the bottom, having the most regressive school finance formula in the nation. There's nothing good about our current formula. Even the per pupil weightings on differential aid don't have the effect that people think they do, like in Manchester. I'm thinking about Mary Heath. For me, these facts provide two key guiding principles for identifying what our core problem is. The most broken part is the unfair distribution. That's got to be fixed. Is it a Massachusetts formula like Dick Ames was saying? I think that that provides a very good indication of where we need to go. But whatever we do, let's not do anything that breaks the things that are good about our system. Remember, we're ranked 3rd in the country in terms of high quality. There are other issues that we've talked about, the revenue issues, targeted property tax relief for people who have low incomes and low wealth. Those are important, but for me, they're not as important as the distribution. I would finally say, why are we having trouble? Why can't we get there? It's obvious the most important constituency here are the kids who live in the less resourced communities. In Claremont, where I went to school, in Manchester, the obstacles are political. Legislators from wealthy communities like this formula. It gives them more money. There are perceptions about the New Hampshire Supreme Court that the legislature can't target aid. That's not accurate if we read provisions like this. And finally, there are interest groups that want to fight bigger fights, tax policy, which is a great fight, but they're holding the education funding formula, the distribution fairness, hostage. And that we should argue against that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Bill. So we're gonna take, instead of taking 10 minutes, we're just gonna take about 5 so we can fit in a brief break and then carry on with our agenda. So just from this group, Bill, Mary, Val, Corinne, and Susan, any follow-up comments just for 5 minutes from the discussion, anything to address?
Well, I'd like to address this issue of local control. And that's an issue we're going to have to beat. Within statute, it says that education is a shared responsibility of local and state. However, that's not the way it works. And so that's a problem which we're going to have to somehow overcome. Does the state need to have more accountability for money to ensure that money that if it is targeted is used appropriately and showing gains and reflecting best practices? All these types of questions need some resolution.
I'd like to talk a little bit about special ed funding. We have what we call catastrophic aid. The funding for that comes in the next year, so taxpayers have to bear the burden of that. I think we need to look at the whole special education issue and figure out a much better way to do that. So I think that's an area that deserves a lot of input and conversation when we get to the funding of the different areas that are being defined in adequacy.
Others?
I would just say that I think that the issues that are being raised, there are so many issues in education, public education, that we really as a commission have to focus like a laser on what we're going to achieve. Mary, I think that if we don't get a formula that drives more aid to Manchester because they've got new Americans, they're very diverse, Boston gets more money in Mass than Wellesley, something's wrong. And if Claremont doesn't get more money than Hanover, something's wrong. And we have to be leaders in making that message. It's a moral justice issue. And the others are important, but we got to focus like a laser on the formula.
Mm-hmm. I wonder, I'd like to, that Mary brought up the fact about those small places in the state budget or in the education funding that non-public schools receive, you know, certain fundings that aren't part of public education and takes away. Like, I think you mentioned the charters get special ed money from the local districts. And, you know, I think if there's any other hidden costs like that, then that should be brought to light because we're trying to support public education with public funds. And that should have a very clear delineation.
Oh, but remember, charter schools are public schools.
Not all of them though, right?
In New Hampshire, the charter schools
they
are
all?
public schools, yes. We
Okay.
have private schools that are completely different, and they don't receive, the LEA covers a part of their special ed costs, but not like what it does for the charter school children.
Okay, all right. I wasn't aware that they were all public. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Val or Susan, final comments before we take a 10-minute break?
I'm good.
Okay.
Can I just reinforce for a second what Val said? I don't know how to say it any differently than he did, but we have some students that graduate and come to work with a 5th grade level mathematics, and they're just not employable. So we have to look down to Lebanon or to Hanover or some other location to find these students, but we don't get them. And so what's happening to our economy up here? It's dissolving. And Hitchner moved out of Littleton. Why? Well, you know, he told me out of every 10 applicants, maybe 1 could do the job. So this inequity has to be stopped, and I hope we can tackle this.
All right, I'm going to jump in then and say thanks to this group and thanks to Carrie. Let's take a big stretch break, refresh your brains and bodies. We'll go until 4:30. So it's 3:31 now. Let's go for a meeting back here at 3:42. And we'll ask Dave and Jay and Mel to initiate the reflections on what they've just heard, and then everybody will jump in. So 3:42 back here, team. Thanks.
Bruce, I'm going to need to switch computers. So I'm going to need to switch computers because I'm running out of juice. Just so if somebody would let me back in, please.
Oh, okay, fine. Yeah, correct. Got it.
Thank you.
We'll let you back in.
Hello there, Susan. Susan Heward.
Hi, Bill.
I just wanted to say hello to you. It's embarrassing that we can't do it in person. Cass says great things, and so I just wanted to, I haven't had a chance yet to say hello.
Well, thank you. Please give my best to Cass. I miss hanging out with her and the other commissioners.
I know that was a great experience. She's got to move off, but she's moving down to a DC organization, CHIA.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Yep. Oh, excuse me.
Bye.
Hello, Susan Heward. I'm pretty good. How are you? It's crazy, but it's fine. Yeah.
Susan, you're not on mute anymore. You might want to mute that so you can talk on the phone.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, August would be terrific. On either a Monday morning or a Friday morning, if you're doing things at those hours. Yeah. That's great. When, yeah, and I spend my life on Zoom.
Hey, Susan, I'll get you lined up here.
So do we have everybody back, Bruce?
Just seeing a couple on Chris has dropped out. I noticed. I'm just trying to scan if we lost anybody else in the transition there. And I don't think Chris had a conflict, but who else isn't here? Raise your hand, as they say. Where's Dick? Did we lose? We lost Dick.
No, I'm here, but I can't start my video.
You should be. You should all be up. There we go. You should be able to.
It said that I couldn't. But no, it says you cannot. The host has asked you to start your video. Okay, let's give it a try.
Should be set now. Yep.
There we go.
All right.
Good.
So
is Jay back?
Jay, I see the J on the screen.
Yeah.
All right, Dave, it's all yours now.
Well, it's actually it's right. You're still doing the driving here, Bruce.
Oh, all right. In that case, I'm going to turn it over to you. No, as I said earlier, we'll because we asked you all to really listen, Dave, know. Why don't we just go to each of you just for a minute or so to.
My video says it's stopped by the host.
No, I thought we unmuted everybody there, but there you go. We should be able to do it now.
Okay, great.
So in any case, let's start with Dave, Jay, and Mel. Just reflections on what you heard, and then full group reflections as well, and anything that we need to highlight to be sure to pay attention to as the work groups continue their work into August. Each of the interim reports contains some goals and objectives for the next month or two, but anything that the whole group wants to say, we really need to look at X, Y, or Z, or figure out X, Y, or Z. And then we're going to, at around a little bit after 4, we'll ask Drew to remind us of what to expect in terms of the cost modeling that they'll be sharing a first draft with us 2 weeks from today. I did hear a number of comments today about, again, the challenge of costing adequacy. I think a lot of us, and I'll include myself, have gotten a little bit hung up on costing the inputs to adequacy, as opposed to costing the opportunity for an adequate education as measured by outcomes, which is, I think, where Drew's going to pull us back in.
Here, here, here.
But then again, we'll get to that in a few minutes. Dave, Jay, Mel, what did you hear that struck you as important?
Well, I'll start. One of the things I think that I heard consistently that we need to address those most needy students and needy districts, and how we define whatever formula or whatever costing pattern. That I've heard that consistent throughout, that everything's not equal, and that we need to be able to deal with those areas where there is disparity and act accordingly. One of the things that was impressed me when we met with Duke, he said 3 things that were guiding principles for him, which I think are very relevant to us. And he said there are 3 things: equity, adequacy, and predictability. And I think that's something that we've, in this last 2 hours, have really been addressing. The issue of the system needs some sense of accountability. I don't think that anything we recommend that hasn't some sense of, it's what I would call the so what syndrome. That if we can't answer so what does this mean, then we're going to not be successful. And I also was taken by Val's comment about the need for some kind of a compelling narrative. I've been very concerned about this, on how do we move. I've said, and David has heard me say this many times, how do we move from my kids to our kids? And to recognize that, everybody talks about workforce development in the state. Oh, workforce development this, workforce development that. Then you hear Rick talk about, well, that doesn't work up here because we have kids that can't do math. So the question is for me is, how do we develop that narrative and tap into the need for reform? Because I think everybody understands the need for reform. The issue is, what's the definition of that? And if you have a context, if you have an umbrella with which that definition gets defined, and how we might fund that, not necessarily dealing with new sources, we may look at that, but how do we redistribute what we currently are doing in a much fairer way? And one of the things that I would hope we might be able to do is to look at those various funding sources. Not that we have to recommend one, but that we can say, okay, if you want a sales tax, this is what it's going to mean to your property tax. You want an income tax? This is what it's going to mean to your property tax. So you can have some kind of a logical conversation about the topic that can understand what's going. My wife's back here saying, Mel, you're shouting, so calm down. So I'm going to calm down. But I think if we can provide, you've talked about all these different options. Well, let's put it out there. Let's talk about it without necessarily advocating one or the other. We should come up with one, but I think we should lay out the whole panoply here of what the options are here. So people will say, hey, I like this one from column 1. I like this from column 2. And so what I'm hearing from everyone here is the need to understand that all things aren't equal in adequate education here. Thank you. Thanks, Diane, for reminding me to be quiet.
A good example of accountability.
Yeah, right, exactly.
David, if you want me to go.
Yeah, jump in.
You get the last word. So
I might not need any word.
All right, I doubt it. One here is that I think we need to allow the AIR process to inform us of the inequities that exist along the lines of density or rurality, English language barriers, free and reduced lunch. I mean, these are disparities that are going to show up, and from that, I think that can inform our adequacy definition, because if we're going to buy into a distribution formula that is trying to address these obvious demographic disparities, then we ought to adjust an adequacy definition to cover those. So this is why I did discriminant analysis in my dissertation, because it's an equation that works in two directions. And so I'm not going to explain it anymore. But I think that will come, and I think we're going to be able to come back to adequacy as a definition and deal with it in the context of where the disparities need to be addressed. So I feel confident on that score. I feel less confident on our outcome measures conversations, and I think if there's something to tee up, it's another presentation, Bruce, around performance and outcome assessment. We've got language here that says every 4 years the commissioner is going to report that to the Education Performance Committee or something like that. That's a legislative committee, and I'm unfamiliar with the report. I don't serve on the committee either. Somebody does, and there probably is a report. The point to this is that the connectedness that people are looking for to career and college readiness, I think it takes years to develop that perspective. So I don't know that we're going to get that within our study's ability to gather the information. What I would be interested in seeing us assess is if the engagement, I don't know that AIR is the party to do it, but if the engagement in CTE has a built-in disparity as to where the CTE centers are located, meaning the ease of attendance at a school that hosts a CTE versus the schools that have to transport and match up time schedules with those CTEs. Anyway, I want to understand what are some of the structural disparities, because they may influence the outcomes and it may not have a cost. So if that's something that we want to fund, see, it's not rewarded in the formula right now. We'll reward, or we're not rewarding, we're trying to compensate for some of the inadequacies, but we're not compensating for inadequaquecies or disparities in access and attendance. So, and then this whole college, if you go to college, it's one thing, but it's the college completion and persistence, which may have a poverty factor built into that. So I'm concerned about outcomes and our ability to measure it and build, if we put some funding in, that we're doing it in the right way to eliminate disparities. Yeah, that's what college scholarship funds are for too, as well. Start to get into a lot of different areas. I think those are the 2 points that I really wanted to make. Oh, the other one has to do with local effort. That if we're going to, I was concerned about the comment that there's a tax cap in Manchester. That's just an example. Tax caps can be enacted with any warrant article that cuts a budget, and you can have one like Franklin does, or you can have one that like Winchester just enacted to cut its budget. The point is, what is local effort need to be in order to provide some equity across the, so that when we do have a state distribution that's trying to equalize opportunity, that local districts don't just set a tax reduction and we're no better off than we were. So there's got to be that local effort performance contribution that is required.
Great, thanks, Jay. Just some quick thoughts on basically what I heard discussed earlier, and I sort of want to reflect back on a comment I made in another meeting earlier today, which basically went along the lines of I'll support just about anything that delivers equitable access to an opportunity for adequate education, and does it through equitable taxation. And I heard a lot of really positive comments this afternoon that really make me feel good about that we're going to be able to get to a point that delivers on equitable access and equitable taxation. I heard comments like the dollars are already being raised, and that there is a will to do it, and there's a will to do it under the pressure of currently in a very inequitable tax environment. There's still the will to do it. Of course, a lot of communities are sort of like they have the will to do it, but they just are beyond the breaking point of actually being able to do it. A lot of communities, and that's a result of the tax inequity we have. But heard comments that I'm not possible. Comments about not being pessimistic, that we've got a solvable problem here, and that if there's credible numbers, there'll be support for it. And that's all I think really, really positive that this commission is going to be able to enact meaningful, make meaningful recommendations that can so the legislature can enact meaningful change in our education funding. And then I also heard a lot of, sort of thinking that I think reflects on what Mel's talked about so many times, which is going from my kids to our kids, and that that making that change in how some people in the state look at paying for public education may be tough, but people recognize, excuse me, that we're all citizens of New Hampshire. I think that was a quote, and I thought that was really meaningful, and that we look at universal, statewide, goals for education, and then I also really liked the phrase, and while we're doing all of this, let's not break what's good. Because there's a lot good about New Hampshire schools, and I think that reflects on the will of the voters who have put their money where their mouth is when saying we want strong outcomes in New Hampshire, and the national data suggests that. The national data suggests it says we've got strong outcomes. It's just not from every school and from every school district. So let's not break what's good, but let's solve the problems that we've got.
So I think, we can turn it back out to the whole group now. Additional reflections, thoughts, contributions. I'll ask that we try not to repeat too much what's previously been said, but if there are new thoughts or questions or insights, let's continue to work this for a few more minutes before we turn to Drew. Yeah, Bill.
Following on Dave's point, I think you mentioned two parts that we've got. One is the distribution formula that tries to get more dollars to those districts who are suffering unreasonable burdens in property taxes. That a good distribution formula does both. Because when Claremont gets more dollars, state dollars, that reduces the burden on the local taxpayer. And that doesn't even get yet to the very complex issue of which tax is a fairer tax, or tax equity within a town. Those are important issues, but I'm just saying, Dave, a way to achieve equity in the distribution formula, it works hand in hand. It does both. It's the only way to reduce unreasonable property tax burdens, is drive more state aid dollars into a community. Thanks.
Yeah, it's sort of operating at the level of principles, not yet solutions, but at least establishing some principles. Other thoughts or additions?
Well, I would clarify something that was mentioned in one of the groups about charter schools being public schools. They are all referred to as public schools, but some of them are not governed by public school boards. They're governed privately. So in that sense, they are not public schools in my mind, even though they're called public schools.
Well, we'll definitely have an opportunity for the charter school conversation. We'll schedule that for sure before it gets to be too much later.
I do want to say though, I've always been a supporter of public education, but they're all our kids. And if we're looking at the larger picture of supports for kids that are connected to the well-being of our state, I do think we need to think about that, particularly as it relates to kids with special needs.
Rick?
Thank you very much, Bruce. Reflecting a little bit back on the November 2018 task force report, I'm just going to read a couple sentences here that are within it. It says, the first is what we think of as regular or traditional public schools. The other is charter public schools. This report will only be discussing the dollars that are provided to traditional public schools. I think we're going to get ourselves into a quagmire if we start trying to discuss in this commission the funding process for charter schools. I think our plate is full with dealing with just the regular, normal, traditional public schools, and see if we can fix the adequacy formula, which now has nothing to say about charter schools within it.
So Rick, I think that may be true, but I think exploring the charter school funding mechanism, I mean, it's a pretty straightforward mechanism. I believe there are some complexities to it that I think need to be explored as well. But I think we should at least bring it up. And I do think the charter schools state support does come from the Educational Trust Fund, and it is in the same, I think it's in the same chapter of the RSAs as adequacy. Jay, am I right on that?
It is in 198.
Yeah.
Although they do have their own statute in 195. Anyway, yeah, if I follow up, I thought there were some interesting legislative options that were suggested in the course of this. The drop the hold harmless ideas. as one of the barriers that exists to having more equity. And the other was retaining at least some portion of the statewide property tax at the state level, however that happens, because I think AIR's evidence in their policy papers, while it wasn't national in its scope, every place where they've had they brought to our attention, Kansas, New Jersey, Vermont studies, all started their redistribution efforts on assuming that dollars would flow to a state for distribution. Now we can do that through a formula, or we can do it through a collection, but not having the ability to collect at least that excess portion is a barrier. And the other thing that Bill, in your stats, I think we take for granted those stats indeed. But the 31% is for me the telling number, because it does indicate that is the lowest amount in the nation, and that explains in and of itself why property tax burdens are as felt so dramatically, is that we just haven't identified other revenue sources that alleviate that for the neediest communities.
Yeah, and several of the group also mentioned some kind of a significant process for tax relief, which we've talked about a little bit, but it would seem to me that as we begin to move forward here, and whatever design we come up with, that we need to have a more robust opportunity for some tax relief for both those who are on fixed incomes and those who are impoverished too.
Right. That's absolutely correct. And also, I think we need to make a distinction, and this goes to the point Bill and Jay was just referencing on the reliance on property taxes. That we need to establish a distinction between a statewide education property tax, or the state property tax, and the local education property tax, because the concept, I think the effective concept behind a state property tax is a tax equity element, whereas the local property tax, as was pointed out earlier, I forget where it was mentioned, ranges all the way from 43 cents per thousand up to like $30 per thousand. And actually, when you look at the real sort of extreme points on that, there's even some local education property taxes that are negative, because there's enough raised through the state property tax to cover their educational costs. Of course, we're talking about districts with very, very few children for school-age kids, but the variability is so wide in New Hampshire. So anyway, that's a big difference between local education property taxes and the state education property tax.
Chris, you had your hand up a minute ago.
Yeah, speaking of small numbers of children, I think one thing we haven't talked about much is how much population loss we've had in the K-12 space and what that might look like.
Christy, that just broke up. Christy, you're breaking up, and I think you're saying something that we don't want to hear.
Yeah.
Try it again. Yeah.
Now we're not getting your audio.
Can't hear you.
No.
Thought it was just the local community, the rural communities that had this issue.
Her audio and video were screwed up.
I think video's okay, but
yeah.
There you go. Try that.
Sometimes disabling your video
Yeah, let me do that.
Yeah.
Your audio's back.
Okay. The rapid loss of population in the K-12 space both creates opportunities and challenges, challenges for the fixed costs in those communities. But if we're looking at distribution, we're also dealing with potentially substantially fewer numbers of kids in our state if the trends continue as they have. And so the amount of money that we've been able to raise and what we're able to do with that money may create some opportunity.
Great. So Dave, with your permission, I think we'll move along to Drew unless there are any other critical comments before we do that. And if we spend a few minutes, Drew, given that you've observed a number of these state commissions and state processes, any comments you want to make about the process or where we are with it right now? And then sort of tee us up for, again, reminding us that your analysis is going to be focused on outcomes, not inputs. And I think that's, today's discussion especially highlights the importance of understanding what it is you'll be providing us and how that will help us have a kind of a different lens for our own analysis here as well. And then we'll try to leave enough time for some public comments at the end.
Yeah, sounds good. So thank you for having me as always. The discussion has been great, and I think you all are right on track with identifying the big issues in the state and thinking about things in a really thoughtful and comprehensive way. So it's been great for me to see this process and to be part of this this group. So thank you for that. In terms of AIR's work moving forward, I think a few people have referenced an August 10th presentation. So in a couple weeks from now, we'll have our preliminary results, and hopefully they'll be pretty much finalized at that point. And so at that presentation, we'll really present the main results that we're expecting from our study. And our results really come in three buckets. The first is equity. And when we talk about equity, we're going to talk about distribution of revenue, the existing revenue and spending across the state's districts. We'll also look at tax equity, and that's quite a bit simpler, and you all pretty much understand the issues there, but what are the tax rates across the state? Who are the districts that have the highest tax rates? What are the districts that have the lowest tax rates? How do the combination of property valuation and tax rates help districts pay for their education in the state? From there, we move on to really look at the distribution of outcomes, the existing outcomes across the state with respect to the different demographic factors, student needs that districts face. So how do student outcomes across the state vary with respect to district poverty rates? And we can look at a couple different indicators of district poverty rates. I know that some of you are interested in different ones, FRL, some other nationally collected poverty rates from the Census Bureau and from the Department of Education. So we can compare those poverty rates and see which are most predictive of student outcomes in New Hampshire. And then we'll also look at English learners, and we'll look at special education students and see how district outcomes vary along those lines. When we're looking at outcomes, we were able to collect 3 different outcomes from the New Hampshire Department of Education. We have assessment data, we have graduation rates, and we also have attendance rates, which we're thinking is kind of a proxy for some of the social emotional type outcomes that you might expect students to face. So students that aren't in school as frequently as other students probably face a lot of issues at home or have some other things that they're dealing with. So those are the outcomes that we're considering. And then our third component of our analysis is going to focus on cost. So it's kind of a combination, putting the distributional aspect and the outcome aspect together. As Bruce mentioned, when we're looking at costs, we're really looking at what is the cost necessary to achieve a given outcome in the state. So we're looking at the distribution of outcomes across the state and the distribution of spending, and pulling in all of those student demographic factors as well, to look at how much does it cost for each district in the state, given their demographic characteristics, to achieve a common level of outcome. And so that's how we develop our cost estimates. From there, from those cost estimates, which are informed by a rather complex model that accounts for all of those things that I just talked about, we pare that down into a simpler model, and the simpler model is analogous to a weighted student funding model. So if we predict those costs that we just came up with using a weighted student funding model, what are the student weights for special education, for FRL, for English learners, for small districts, that get us closest to those predicted costs that we just estimated. So we'll be developing a weighted student formula that helps us get close to those predicted costs. So that's what we're working on. And for the presentation, I guess shortly after the presentation, we'll also be sharing with you a tool that will basically an Excel spreadsheet that allows, that comes preset with some of the weights that I just mentioned, that show how the distribution of costs will be distributed across each of New Hampshire's districts. So it has all of New Hampshire's districts in the spreadsheet, and we'll show how the costs are distributed according to our weighted student funding model, and how those costs compare to their actual per pupil spending currently. So that will be a very useful tool to show you how the weighted student funding model works. And it'll also allow you, if you want to make some tweaks to our recommended weights, you can plug in your own weights and see how that affects the distribution as well. So you kind of have some options to play around with that and see how different things work, and to see how different assumptions affect the distribution of funding according to this model. And along with that simulator, we'll be modeling revenue and how revenue could be raised to meet the costs that we come up with. So we're going to be working with a couple of very simple revenue options. Some of the revenue options that you all are discussing are more complex than what we can show in a simple simulator tool. But basically, if you set a minimum local contribution, let's say it's $5 per 1,000, that raises a certain amount of revenue for each district. The assumption is that the state will have to fill in the remaining amount of revenue beyond the minimum local contribution. So we'll have an amount that's coming from your general state revenue sources, and then the rest will probably we'll be assuming will come from the statewide property tax. And we'll also be assuming that the statewide property tax is not will actually be a true statewide property tax, and will be able to be redistributed and not just stick with the local district. So we'll be showing how revenue could be distributed under those assumptions to meet the needs of the predicted costs that we come up with. So that's what we're working on. And then by the end of the month, we'll have a full report that has all of this presented as well, and some text that goes along with it.
Thanks, Drew. Dave, questions?
Questions, Dick?
It's just a quick question, Drew. You mentioned developing costs by district, I think. And will those also be developed by municipality?
No, we're just going to be working with district level data at this point.
So,
go ahead.
Dick, do you want to talk? Dick, can you shed a little light on your question?
Well, so much that we do is municipality based. formulation right now is a municipal formulation in terms of sorting out adequacy aid and tax obligations. And so it would take me some time to think about it, how we would transfer from a district number to a municipal number. What we work with is both, but we have the municipal information. Would we have it? I'm not sure.
You're talking about for the cooperative districts.
Yeah, cooperative districts. What about a district that's a municipality that's part of two districts?
So, I mean, so where this comes in is more on the tax side and the distribution side as well. So I know in your existing adequacy aid formula, it starts with municipalities and then rolls up to districts. I mean, yeah, it certainly adds another layer of complexity, and I'm not sure that AIR, given the data that we have, which is mostly at the district level, will be able to deal with that complexity. I think our district level modeling will get you pretty close. And then, like you said, there will probably have to be some sort of transferring of that to the municipality level. But I think our district level modeling will get you 99% of the way there.
Well, just to say, I think we need to look at that and think about it. I don't really know offhand, but it is stepping into a different matrix than the one that we're accustomed to looking at when we try to assess adequacy and tax obligations.
Right, but the things where the characteristics that we're looking at are, well, I guess for small districts, I think that would potentially, I mean, you could apply all of the characteristics to the municipality level. So the EL students, the FRL students, special education students, and then you just have to apply the district size to the municipality level as well. So that
it may be transferable. I think that's what you're getting at.
Yeah.
Dick, I think you put your finger on something that we may want to look at as a commission, as a recommendation. That differential has plagued ed funding efforts for 25 years. And it's between DRA and DOE. So I'm looking forward to seeing how that plays out. That could be fixed.
Yep.
Yeah.
So no, Dick, thanks for bringing it up. I think we're going to have to keep our eyes on that and dig into that further when we get the recommendations from AIR. So, Bill, did you have your hand up for another?
Nope, I'm all set. I'm so much looking forward to the AIR stuff.
Mm-hmm. Terrific. Anybody else have a hand up? I'm not seeing any there, and I'm not seeing any on the screen. Jay.
Yeah. Well, just to say that I think I was thinking similar to Dick about towns, and in any case, I think somebody, some subgroup, maybe in the fiscal committee, ought to see what kind of crosswalk is possible to address Dick's issue. I don't think that's a fair question to give to AIR without us having tried to grapple with it. So.
Right. No, I agree with that, Jay. I was just saying that AIR is going to come back with district level recommendations, and we'll just have to see. And some of those districts may already have I guess, terms in their agreements on how to do that. Others may not. So we'll look at that, I think, pretty carefully. And I agree. I think that's fiscal policy will need to take a look at that. So, any other thoughts or questions while we're here? If not, I'm going to open up the floor to members of the community, members of the public who've been here with us, many for the last almost 3.5 hours, and to share any comments they'd like to share with the members of the commission. So Jordan, can you drive us through this? So yeah. So any members of the public that are with us, if you just want to raise your hand, if you're on Zoom video, if you're dialed in, I think it's a star
9.
Star 9. So I'm not seeing any right now, but we'll give it another. I've seen one with from John Tobin. Hey, John, you're with us here.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. My comment is just a real quick one. And the models that AIR are talking about sound wonderful and will answer a lot of questions. I just hope that as part of those, when you see how various revenue will be raised and how it will be allocated, one of the things I think we want to look at is what will the local tax rates be at the end of that model? So that if, for instance, you are doing some targeting and you're doing a targeting for a portion of the cost of what you define as adequacy, what will the local districts be asked to pay, and what will their tax rates be? And the point obviously is to see, does the model solve the tax rate problem? That's all I have to say.
Okay, great. Thank you, John. Any other thoughts? Anybody that's dialed in or on an attendee with Zoom on Zoom would like to share with us today? We generally do make try to reserve the last 10-15 or so minutes commission meetings for public comment, and there'll be another general public comment meeting middle of August, and then we'll actually start having, I think, 2 a month beginning for September and October and November. So well, I think people have heard enough today. Anybody else have anything for the good of the cause they'd like to share at this point? We've got we're 2 minutes early, Bruce.
Yeah, so let's make everybody sit here.
Yeah.
Just 3.5 hours, that was great. We collected harvested a lot of good information today, and this will be kind of a milestone for us, I think. And obviously we have a lot to digest after but I think the guidance back to the respective work groups is about right. I know that the question was raised earlier about in the second half of our work, is this the right structure for us in work groups? We'll ask that in the executive team. And a week from today, we'll have work group meetings. 2 weeks from today, back as a full commission with AIR. And we have a few more presentations. It sounds like we need to add to our knowledge base from charter schools, and I think there was maybe one other in there too that I know.
Performance outcomes.
Performance options, right. So we'll track that down.
Right.
I'm good.
Great. Well, I gotta say this is a great team. I thought today was a really, really good, great meeting and great comments, and everybody's working not only really hard, but have, I think, a really deep down understanding of the problems that funding public education faces here in New Hampshire, and are interested in getting us to a better place. So I really I can't say enough about how much I appreciate working with each of you, and I hope someday when it's safe and the time's right and all that, that we can all get together again live and in person, and whether it's for a meeting or whether we're done our business, and we can just sort of appreciate all the time we're spending with each other. So anyway,
it may be that
great. I've used up all the time, Bruce.
Whenever that happens, the temperature may be about 70 degrees lower than it is today, and we'll all still be 6 feet apart, but we'll be outdoors, we'll be together. We hope for that.
All right, Bruce, when's our next event?
Just a week from today, work group meetings a week from today. And
Okay.
We'll send out agendas and reminders.
Great. Hey, everybody, thank you all very much. Be well and stay cool. Enjoy the week.